Welcome to the volume number 2 of Nightmare Tales for Sleeping. Enjoy your sleep with this frightening stories. Let's begin with story number 1, but before, don't forget to subscribe before falling asleep. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a simple retreat into nature to escape the chaos of everyday life. My friends and I, Emily, Jack, and Sarah, had been planning this for months, eager to unplug, hike through the woods, and enjoy the serenity of a secluded cabin in the mountains. We arrived late on Friday evening, the sky already dark, the air cool and crisp with the promise of an autumn chill. The cabin was nestled on the edge of a dense forest, the trees stretching far beyond what we could see. It seemed like the perfect place to disconnect from the world. The first night was calm. We lit a fire in the hearth, shared a few drinks, and settled into a cozy rhythm. The creaking of the old wooden house was oddly soothing, as though it had lived there for centuries, silently watching the world change. We laughed about how silly it was to be worried about anything. After all, this was just a cabin in the woods, no big deal. But as the night wore on, the wind began to pick up. The trees outside rustled ominously, their branches tapping against the windows. It felt almost as if something, or someone, was trying to get our attention. We shrugged it off, but the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to grow heavier, like a presence had slipped inside with us, unseen. I went to bed early, eager to get some rest before our hike the next day. As I lay in the darkness, trying to drift off, I heard a faint noise, something soft, like footsteps. I froze, listening intently. The house was old, and it was probably just the wind or the house settling. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were too deliberate, too rhythmic. I told myself I was imagining things and closed my eyes, hoping to sleep through the noise. But it persisted. I heard the soft thudding of steps, coming closer to my door. My heart raced as the sound grew louder. I told myself it was just Emily or Jack checking on me. But no one knocked, and no one entered. I lay there, wide-eyed, listening to the silence that followed. Whatever it was, it had gone away. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only the eerie stillness in their wake. I tried to shake off the creeping unease and eventually managed to fall asleep. The next morning, I tried to brush it off as a bad dream. We all set out for a hike into the woods, our backpacks filled with snacks and water. The forest was beautiful, tall trees, dappled sunlight, the sound of birds in the distance. It felt like we were the only ones in the world. But there was something off about it. The air was too still, the silence too complete. As we walked deeper into the forest, we came across an old stone structure, a crumbling wall overgrown with ivy. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong. Jack, ever the curious one, suggested we investigate. We pushed our way through the thick underbrush, and when we reached the wall, we found something strange. Etched into the stone were symbols I couldn't recognize. They looked ancient, as though they had been carved by someone long forgotten. "What do you think this is?" Sarah asked, her voice tinged with unease. "I don't know," I replied, my stomach tightening, "but I don't think we should mess with it." We stood there for a few moments, staring at the symbols, when a chill swept through the air. It was sudden, biting, as though the temperature had dropped by several degrees in the blink of an eye. Emily shivered, rubbing her arms. "Let's go back," I suggested, my voice unusually tense. But as we turned to leave, something caught my eye. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. It was a man, or at least I thought it was. His face was obscured by a dark hood, and he stood unnaturally still, as though he was waiting for something. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Everyone turned to look, but the figure was gone, vanishing into the thick trees. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. It was too strange, too unsettling. We made our way back to the cabin, each of us quiet, lost in our own thoughts. I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the woods. Who was he? Why was he watching us? But when we arrived back, the cabin was eerily silent. It was too quiet, too still. That night, after a quiet dinner, we sat around the fire, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over us. The wind howled outside, the trees scratching at the walls like desperate fingers. And then, just as we were about to call it a night, I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, they were louder, closer. Someone, or something, was moving around outside. We all froze, our eyes meeting in the dim light of the fire. The footsteps continued, moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate, like something circling its prey. My pulse raced. I couldn't breathe. The noise was too real, too close. "Who's out there?" Jack called, his voice trembling. There was no response. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and for a moment, everything went silent. Then, the door to the cabin creaked, as though something was pushing against it from the outside. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. We all slowly got up, tiptoeing toward the door, hearts pounding in our chests. I glanced out the window, but there was nothing there, no sign of anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone, that something, or someone, was waiting for us. The door slowly creaked open just a few inches. My breath caught in my throat, and then we saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, its face hidden in shadow. But it wasn't a person. It was something wrong. Its eyes gleamed like black pits, empty and hollow, and its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones. It didn't move. It didn't speak. We backed away in terror, but the figure didn't follow. It stood there, watching us, waiting. We slammed the door shut, bolting it as best we could. The rest of the night was a blur of fear, whispers, and unsettling noises. We couldn't sleep. We couldn't think. All we could do was wait for morning and hope that whatever had been watching us was gone by then. The next day, we packed up quickly, not daring to stay any longer. As we left the cabin behind, I glanced back, feeling the weight of those dark eyes watching me, and I knew one thing for sure. The woods had not let us go. Not yet.
I've been asked why I don't talk about this, why I never mention it. The truth is, it's because I don't want anyone to think I'm crazy. I know what happened. I know what I saw. But there are things in this world that are better left unsaid. Things that can change how people look at you. And after everything that happened, I'm not sure I'd blame anyone for thinking I was losing my mind. But I'll tell you anyway, because I need to. Because the nightmare still hasn't ended. It was just a weekend like any other. My friends, Matt, Jason, and I were hanging out at my place. We were typical teenagers at the time, all of us trying to find something to entertain ourselves. We'd been bored for hours, mindlessly flipping through channels on the TV, laughing at stupid memes online, and joking about anything that came to our minds. But then, out of nowhere, Jason brought up something we hadn't done in a while. The Ouija board. You know, for fun. At first, we all just kind of laughed it off. I hadn't thought about that game in years. It sounded ridiculous. Honestly, my mom had told me never to mess with things like that. But at that moment, in the heat of boredom, none of us thought it would be a big deal. We were just three dumb kids looking for something to do, right? "Yeah, let's do it," Matt said, his voice eager. "It's just a game." The thing was, Jason had an old Ouija board stashed away in a box under his bed. His uncle had given it to him when he was younger, claiming it was an authentic one, even though we didn't really believe that at the time. Jason brought it over, and we set the board up in the middle of my living room floor, surrounded by candles and dim lights to make it feel more authentic. It was all a joke, or so we thought. "Are you sure about this?" I asked, half jokingly, trying to make it seem like I wasn't scared. But honestly, a part of me was uneasy. I didn't want to seem like a coward in front of Matt and Jason. Jason just grinned. "Don't worry, man. It's all for fun. Nothing's gonna happen." We all sat down around the board, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette. The air felt thick, though it was hard to tell if it was just my imagination. I could hear the clock ticking in the background, each second louder than the last, filling the room with an unnerving rhythm. "Is anyone there?" Jason asked, his voice half mocking but also tense. We waited. Nothing happened. The planchette didn't move. Well, that's boring, Matt muttered. Maybe we should try asking something else. But before we could make another joke or ask a silly question, something strange happened. The planchette moved. Slowly at first, and then faster, as if something, was pushing it from underneath. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Did you do that? I asked Jason, but his face was just as pale as mine. Matt was staring at the board, his mouth agape. The planchette slid across the board, stopping at yes. My stomach twisted in knots. The air felt colder, like something had just entered the room. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. It wasn't normal. This wasn't a joke anymore. I could feel a presence, something that wasn't supposed to be there. Who are you? Jason asked, his voice now shaking slightly. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out one word. Leave. The room fell silent. I couldn't explain what I was feeling, but it was a gut-wrenching sense of wrongness, like we had crossed some invisible line we shouldn't have. My skin crawled, and I could see the same fear in Matt and Jason's eyes. We all knew something was terribly off. I think we should stop, I said, but my voice sounded distant, as though I wasn't really in control of it. Jason seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then nodded in agreement. We pulled our fingers off the planchette, but it didn't stop moving. It slid across the board again, this time faster, more erratically. The flames of the candles flickered violently as if the air itself was being disturbed. It felt like the room was closing in on us, like the walls were pressing down, and the floor beneath us was shifting. Then, the lights went out. All at once. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and the only sound was the frantic beating of our hearts. We all scrambled to turn on our phones, but the screens flickered, too, glitching as if the power itself was being drained from the room. Get out, a voice whispered from somewhere in the dark. It wasn't any of us. It wasn't even human. It was low, guttural, as if something was speaking from deep within the earth itself. Panic surged through me. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My body was frozen, trapped in place as though some unseen force was holding me back. My breathing became shallow, the air thick and suffocating. Matt screamed. I don't know if it was the fear, the adrenaline, or something else entirely, but suddenly everything felt wrong. The room, the darkness, the air, it was all wrong. Jason, who had been the one to suggest the board in the first place, was shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were wide, frantic, as he looked around, as if expecting something to appear. And then, something did. A figure, pale and distorted, flickered in and out of existence in the corner of the room. It was like a shadow, but it wasn't. It was wrong. It was too tall, its limbs elongated in unnatural ways, and its face, if you could even call it a face, was a twisted mess of shadows and hollow eyes. It wasn't until Matt screamed again, a sound that ripped through the darkness like a knife, that I realized the figure wasn't just an illusion. It was real. Suddenly, everything became a blur. My heart raced as I tried to move, but the figure was too fast. It darted toward us, its limbs twitching and jerking in unnatural ways. The room was spinning, and I could barely catch my breath. The figure reached out to grab Jason, its fingers like claws, sharp and cold. I don't know what happened after that. Everything went black. I woke up in my bed, disoriented and covered in cold sweat. It took me a few moments to gather my thoughts and realize where I was. The familiar, dimly lit room. The same old posters on the walls. It felt like a dream, like nothing had happened. But I knew something had. My heart was pounding in my chest as if the terror was still with me. I tried to sit up, but the movement felt unnatural, as if I had just woken from something that didn't belong in this world. My phone was beside me, still buzzing with notifications. But as I picked it up, I noticed something strange. The screen was cracked, and the battery was completely dead. I hadn't even been asleep long enough for it to drain that much. Panic began creeping in again. I had to find Matt and Jason. I rushed out of my room, almost tripping over my own feet. The house felt different now, too quiet. The usual creaks of the floorboards were gone. Even the air felt still, like it had been holding its breath. I ran to the living room, where we'd played the Ouija, but it was empty. The candles, still untouched, sat on the floor around the board, which was eerily in place, as though nothing had happened at all. Where were they? What happened? I thought I'd seen Matt, heard him scream. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the house, sending chills down my spine. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound came from somewhere deep in the house. It was like something was waiting for me, hunting me, and it was getting closer. Without thinking, I sprinted toward the source of the noise. My footsteps echoed in the silence, louder than they should have been. The hallway stretched before me, dark and suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. I turned a corner and nearly stumbled over Matt's body. He was lying on the floor, motionless, his eyes wide open and unblinking. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his mouth hung open, frozen in an expression of pure terror. My chest tightened, and I rushed to his side, shaking him. "Matt! Matt! Wake up!" There was no response. He was cold to the touch, his body stiff, as if he had been dead for hours. But he hadn't been. I had seen him just moments ago. Something was terribly wrong. I scrambled to my feet and ran to Jason's room. I didn't even bother to knock. I just flung the door open. What I saw made my stomach lurch. Jason was there, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall. His eyes were wide, vacant, staring at nothing. His hands twitched at his sides, and he was muttering something under his breath, though I couldn't make it out. The words sounded like an incantation, but it wasn't any language I recognized. It was distorted. "Jason," I whispered, stepping closer. "What happened? Are you okay?" At the sound of my voice, Jason's head snapped toward me. His eyes were no longer his own. They were black, completely black, like hollow voids. I took a step back, my heart racing in my chest. "Get out," he whispered hoarsely, his voice low and strained. "It's already too late." "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What happened to Matt? Where is he?" Jason didn't respond. Instead, he reached up and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. His nails dug into my skin like claws, and I tried to pull away, but it was impossible. His grip tightened, and he pulled me closer to him, his lips curling into a twisted smile that wasn't his own. "I warned you," he hissed. "Now you're mine too." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls distorted, the floor beneath me felt unstable, and the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own. It was as if the room was no longer a part of this world. A cold wind blew through the cracks in the windows, extinguishing the candles and casting everything into darkness. And then, I heard it again. That growl. It was closer now, closer than ever. I finally broke free from Jason's grip, stumbling backward. I didn't care anymore about asking questions. I didn't care about the truth. All that mattered now was getting out. I turned and bolted for the front door, but as I reached it, the handle twisted on its own, locking itself. I pulled at the door frantically, but it wouldn't budge. "Help!" I screamed, pounding on the door, but there was no answer. No sound, just that terrifying growl, now surrounding me from every direction. I turned around slowly, my heart stopping in my chest as I saw the shadow standing in the doorway. It was tall, taller than anything human, and its form was an inky blackness that seemed to suck in all the light around it. The creature moved toward me, its limbs twisting and contorting unnaturally as it approached. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, its feet barely touching the ground. In its hands, it held something that made my blood run cold. It was the Ouija board, the one we had used. It floated in its hands like it was being carried by an unseen force, the planchette moving wildly across it, spelling out words faster than I could read. The letters seemed to bleed into one another, like they were written in blood. And then, it stopped. The letters formed one last message. "Now, you're mine." The creature lunged at me. I stumbled backward, my body heavy with terror, my mind screaming for me to run, to do anything to escape. But the creature was too fast. Before I could even turn to flee, Its cold, skeletal hand shot out and grabbed my arm, its fingers digging into my skin like claws. The pain was unbearable, but what was worse was the overwhelming sense of cold that seeped into my very bones, chilling me to the core. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat, strangled by an invisible force. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, and I felt the room begin to spin as though gravity itself was losing its grip on reality. My vision blurred, and I could hear Jason's voice echoing in my mind, a distorted whisper from somewhere deep within the house. Get out. Get out before it's too late. But it was already too late. There was no escape. I felt myself being pulled toward the creature, and I struggled with every ounce of strength I had left, but it was no use. Its grip was like iron, unyielding. As it dragged me closer, I saw its face, or what passed for a face. It wasn't human. It was a twisted mockery of a person's features, pale and stretched, with eyes that were nothing more than empty black pits. Its mouth opened, impossibly wide, and the smell of decay and rot filled the air, making me gag. Please, no. I gasped, but it was as if the creature was deaf to my pleas. Its mouth opened even wider, its teeth jagged and yellow, ready to consume me whole. But just as I thought I was done for, the lights flickered again. The creature froze for a moment, and I took the opportunity to shove it off me, pushing with all my strength. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I bolted for the back door this time, tearing through the house, my heart thudding in my chest, my feet barely touching the ground as I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just away, as far as possible. I reached the back door, and to my relief, the handle didn't resist this time. I flung it open, but as I stepped outside into the backyard, I was hit with a blast of cold air so sharp it took my breath away. The moon was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard, and the night felt impossibly quiet, like the world had gone still. But then I heard it again. That growl. Louder this time. More insistent. It was coming from the trees. From the woods behind my house. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know what was out there. But my feet seemed to move on their own, as if drawn by an unseen force. Slowly, I turned my head toward the woods. And that's when I saw them. Figures. Dark shapes standing among the trees, their forms barely visible against the backdrop of the night. There were more of them now, too many to count. They were watching me, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, their mouths opening and closing in unison, as if speaking a language I couldn't understand. I wanted to run. I needed to run. But I couldn't. It was like my body had frozen in place, like the terror had paralyzed me completely. One of the figures stepped forward, its form slowly materializing into something more solid, more real. And then I saw it. The face. A face I would never forget. It was Jason's face. But it wasn't Jason anymore. It was twisted, warped, as if his very being had been consumed, replaced by something else. The eyes were black, the same as they had been before, and the smile stretched unnaturally wide across his face. No! I whispered, my voice breaking. What happened to you? What did it do to you? Jason, or whatever was left of him, grinned at me, the corners of his mouth cracking as if the muscles couldn't stretch any further. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. It's not over, you know. You can't escape it. It's already inside you. I shook my head, not wanting to believe him. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. But it was. It was all too real. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble, and the trees around me began to shift, bending and warping, as if the very earth was being corrupted. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and I felt my lungs burn with every breath I took. The figures in the woods moved closer, their eyes locking onto mine, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were closing in on me. And then, I heard that voice again, the deep, guttural whisper that had haunted me earlier. Join us. Suddenly, everything went black. When I woke up, I was no longer outside. I was lying on the cold, hard floor of what seemed to be a basement. My head ached terribly, and my vision was blurry. I tried to push myself up, but a sharp pain shot through my ribs, causing me to collapse back down. The darkness surrounding me was suffocating, but I could make out faint outlines of walls, cracked, covered in dirt and old, peeling wallpaper. It was so different from the house I knew. This place, it felt wrong. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. The air was thick with something foul, the kind of stench that made your stomach turn, and there was a distant, low hum, like the sound of a machine running, or maybe breathing. I reached for my phone, but it was gone. Panic surged through me, but I pushed it down. I needed to focus. What happened? How did I get here? As I tried to stand up again, I heard a familiar sound, the scrape of wood against stone. The sound of movement. Matt? Jason? I called out, my voice hoarse, barely audible. No answer. Then I heard it. A soft, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My heart leapt in my chest, my breath catching in my throat as I looked around in the darkness. Suddenly, a faint light flickered, illuminating part of the room. It was an old, rusted lamp, barely casting any glow, but it was enough for me to see the figure standing across the room. It was Matt, but it wasn't Matt. His eyes were wide open, but they were nothing like I remembered. They were black, completely void of any color, and his skin had a sickly, pale hue to it. His mouth was slightly open, but it wasn't him speaking. It was something else. "Leave this place," the voice hissed, but it wasn't Matt's voice. It was guttural, distorted, and filled with malice. The sound seemed to reverberate in my skull, making my head spin. I took a step back, my legs weak beneath me. "Matt? What happened to you?" His lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was something twisted, something unnatural. "The more you resist," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty room, "the worse it will be." I didn't wait. I turned to run, but I was too slow. The figure lunged at me, grabbing me by the shoulders and slamming me against the wall. I could feel the coldness of its touch, the icy fingers digging into my skin like they were trying to tear through me. My body went numb, and I felt the world around me warp, the walls shifting and bending, as though the room itself was alive. I struggled to break free, but I couldn't. The grip was too strong. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mind raced with panic as I realized the horrible truth. This wasn't just some nightmare. It was real. I could feel something ancient, something evil, pressing against my chest, suffocating me, drowning me in darkness. The growls from before filled the room again, louder now, shaking the very air. Then, I heard a whisper, soft, almost soothing, like a lullaby. "Let it in." It wasn't Matt anymore. It was the creature, the thing that had been following us. I could feel its presence, crawling into my mind, infecting my thoughts. I felt its will, its hunger, pushing me to accept it, to let it take me. And in that moment, I almost did. I could feel my resolve slipping away, my will breaking. I closed my eyes, trying to block it out, trying to fight it. But the darkness was so overpowering. I didn't know if I could hold on much longer. But then, a sudden burst of light pierced through the darkness. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. The light grew brighter, blinding in its intensity. The figure holding me loosened its grip, the coldness fading as the light pushed it back. I could feel the pressure on my chest lifting, the suffocating presence loosening its hold on me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed myself away from the wall, stumbling toward the light. And as I neared it, I saw something I didn't expect. It was a doorway, a wooden door, cracked and ancient, but it was glowing with the same intense light. Without thinking, I rushed toward it, throwing myself through the door. As I passed through, everything went quiet. The growls, the whispers, the crushing darkness, it all faded away. I collapsed onto the cold, hard floor, gasping for breath. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. But when I looked around, I realized something horrifying. I was back at the house, the same one where it had all started. I wasn't safe. I tried to stand, but my body felt weak, like the air itself was pulling me down. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, filling my mind. And I knew then that no matter how far I ran, no matter what I did, it wasn't over. The door slammed shut behind me. I couldn't move. My limbs felt as though they were made of lead, and every step felt like an eternity. The house around me, once familiar, now seemed like a maze. The walls were distorted, shifting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Every corner I turned, every doorway I passed, felt like it led to a new nightmare. The air was thick with a sense of dread that clung to me like a second skin. I could still hear those whispers, low, mocking, barely audible, but always present, gnawing at my sanity. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my throat was dry, and every word I tried to form came out as a strangled rasp. The darkness around me seemed to swallow any sound, leaving me alone with my thoughts, and the growing realization that whatever was happening wasn't just in my mind. It was real. My heart hammered in my chest as I stumbled through the hallways, my eyes darting around, searching for any sign of escape. But the house seemed endless. No matter which door I opened, no matter which window I looked through, there was nothing but more darkness. I felt like I was trapped in some twisted version of reality, one where the laws of physics and time no longer applied. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up in terror. The movement was too quick to be real, too erratic. But I knew what I had seen. It was Matt. But it wasn't him. Not really. His face, no, whatever was left of his face, was twisted, distorted beyond recognition. His eyes were wide, vacant, black pits that seemed to stare right through me. His mouth was open, but it wasn't a sound that came out. It was a hiss, a low growl that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. He stepped forward, or rather, he lurched. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like he was being controlled by something else. His body seemed to bend in ways that shouldn't have been possible, and I could hear the cracking of his joints, the sickening sound of bones breaking and reforming as if his very being was being reassembled. "Matt, no, this isn't you," I whispered, my voice shaking. "Please, tell me you're okay." He didn't respond. Instead, he lunged at me with unnatural speed. His hands, cold and clammy, grabbed my arm, and I felt a surge of ice-cold dread rush through my veins. The pressure of his grip was like a vice, his fingers digging into my flesh as if he were trying to rip me apart. I tried to pull away, but it was useless. His strength was otherworldly, far beyond anything a human should have been capable of. I kicked and screamed, but no one came. There was only the sound of Matt's heavy breathing, the rasping growl that seemed to reverberate from deep within his chest. And then I saw it, the dark figure behind him. It was massive, towering over Matt's distorted form. Its face was a blur of shadows, its eyes glowing red, like burning embers in the darkness. It had no real shape, no clear form, only a mass of shifting shadows and tendrils that writhed and stretched, reaching toward me with an inhuman hunger. "Please, help me," I gasped, my voice barely a whisper. But there was no one to hear me. The creature leaned in, its mouth opening wider, impossibly wide, as if it was about to consume me whole. I could feel its breath, hot, rancid, on my face. The stench of death and decay flooded my senses, and I couldn't breathe. My body went numb as I was pulled closer, drawn into the void that threatened to swallow me whole. And then, just as I thought I would be consumed, I remembered the door. The door I had passed through earlier. The one that had somehow led me back here. With everything I had left, I pushed against Matt, my legs burning as I kicked out at the creature's tendrils, but nothing seemed to stop it. Desperation surged through me, and I bolted for the door. I didn't care if I was running into another trap. I just needed to get out. But when I reached the door, it was locked. Panic exploded in my chest as I rattled the handle, yanking on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The sound of the creature's growls grew louder, more insistent, and the pressure on my chest was unbearable. Then I heard a voice. It was faint, distant, but it was there. "Matt, don't let it go." I whipped around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. No one except Matt. His eyes were locked on mine, but there was something different about him now. A flicker of recognition, of something human, glimmered behind those black eyes. "Matt, please," I begged, my voice shaking. "You have to fight it. Don't let it take you." His mouth moved, but the words didn't come from him. They were from somewhere else. "I can't," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a hollow echo that seemed to resonate in the very air around me. "It's too late." Suddenly, Matt's body jerked, and I saw something even more horrifying than I could have imagined. A black, smoky substance began to pour from his mouth, from his eyes, from every pore in his skin. It was the same substance that had filled the house, the same darkness that had followed us from the moment we'd played with the Ouija board. It was the entity, the demon. The darkness enveloped Matt, wrapping around him like a suffocating blanket. His body twitched and convulsed as the entity took control, his limbs moving in unnatural ways. His face was consumed by the darkness, and for a moment, I saw nothing but shadow where his features had been. And then, it was gone. Just like that. The darkness receded, and the house fell silent once more. I was alone. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands shaking as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. The house was silent again, eerily so. The suffocating presence that had filled every inch of the space was gone, but it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me. My heart still pounded in my chest, but there was no longer any sound, no movement. Only the crushing weight of the silence. I stood up slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. I wanted to scream, to let out the fear and confusion that was clawing at my insides, but I didn't. I couldn't. Not anymore. I couldn't trust my own voice, not after hearing Matt's last words, not after seeing what had become of him. I couldn't even trust myself. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing in the emptiness, the sense of dread growing with every footstep. The darkness around me felt alive, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. But I had no choice. I had to get out. I tried every door, but each one was locked. Each one refused to open, as though the house itself was keeping me trapped inside. The light in the hallway flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I couldn't help but feel like they were alive, following me, inching closer with every step I took. And then, I heard it. A sound so faint, I thought I was imagining it at first. But then it came again, louder this time. It was a whisper, soft and slithering, like a serpent crawling into my mind. "Run, run, run." The voice came from everywhere, echoing in my head, filling me with a primal fear I couldn't shake. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I spun around, trying to find the source of the sound, but the hallway was empty. There was nothing there, no one, but I knew it was real. The walls began to close in on me, the air growing thick, suffocating. The temperature dropped, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. It was as though the very house was alive, reacting to my fear, feeding off of it. My skin crawled as the whispers turned into growls, the kind that reverberate deep in your chest, vibrating your bones. I could feel the pressure building, a presence behind me, drawing closer. And then I saw it, a figure in the distance, shrouded in darkness, standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, far taller than any human should have been. Its silhouette seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like it was trying to remain hidden, yet constantly shifting. I couldn't move. I was frozen, my body refusing to cooperate as terror gripped me like an iron vice. The figure took a step forward, and another. With each step, I could feel the air grow heavier, the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was coming closer, and I knew, deep down, that it was the thing I had been running from all this time. The entity that had followed us after the Ouija board. It had found me. I turned to run, but my legs refused to obey. I stumbled forward, but the hallway stretched out before me, an endless, twisting labyrinth. The walls seemed to move, the doors slamming shut as I passed, trapping me in a maze I couldn't escape. The whispers were all around me now, surrounding me, their voices like 1,000 insects crawling under my skin. I ran faster, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my body shaking with fear, but it didn't matter. The house was alive, and it wasn't going to let me leave. No matter how fast I ran, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something that made my heart stop. At the end of the hallway, where the figure had been, was a door. It was the door. The one that had led me back here. The one that had somehow opened to this nightmare. I ran toward it, my hands outstretched, and I threw myself against the door. It opened. For a moment, I thought I was free. I thought I had made it out. But when I stepped through, I realized I wasn't in the same place. I was in the basement. The same cold, damp basement where I had first woken up. The one that had felt so wrong, so unnatural. I spun around, my heart racing in my chest. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard the same faint whisper again, this time more insistent. Let it in. I turned to see the figure once more, looming in the shadows, its eyes glowing a deep, menacing red. It was standing at the top of the stairs, staring at me with a gaze so cold, so filled with malice, that it made my blood run cold. I was trapped. There was nowhere to run anymore. And as the figure took another step forward, the darkness around me seemed to pulse, like it was breathing. It was waiting for me, drawing me in, feeding off my fear. I fell to my knees, my mind spinning, the reality of what was happening crashing down on me. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, echoing in my skull. They were all around me, inside me. Let it in. I couldn't escape. There was no way out. And in that moment, I understood. The house wasn't just a place. It was a prison for the damned. And I was its newest inhabitant. I could feel the darkness closing in on me, wrapping itself around my body like a suffocating shroud. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they felt like they were inside my very bones. My vision blurred as the shadows swirled around me, thick and oppressive. The figure at the top of the stairs stepped closer, its eyes glowing with that malevolent, otherworldly light. I couldn't escape. I couldn't even move. And then, a voice, clear and sharp, cut through the fog of fear in my mind. You have to fight it. It wasn't my voice. It was Matt's. I froze. The words reverberated in my mind, and for the briefest of moments, I felt a glimmer of hope. Matt. I remembered the way he had looked at me before everything had gone to hell. There had been something human left in him. Maybe there was still a chance. Fight it, the voice repeated, this time louder, more forceful. I didn't know how to fight this. How do you fight something that isn't bound by the laws of reality? But I had no choice. If there was a chance, even the smallest one, I had to take it. I couldn't let Matt's sacrifice be in vain. I couldn't let myself become another soul lost to this damnable house. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the darkness swirled around me like a storm, but I focused on the voice, on Matt's last words. I closed my eyes, blocking out the terror, the overwhelming sense of doom. I had to find the strength to push through it. In that moment, I reached deep into myself, trying to call upon whatever was left of the person I had been before all of this. The boy who had been so naive, who had laughed at the idea of demons and ghosts and things beyond comprehension. I remembered his courage, his defiance. I needed that part of myself now more than ever. I won't let you win, I whispered through gritted teeth, my voice trembling but resolute. I won't. The shadows hissed, recoiling as if they hadn't expected my resistance. But they didn't retreat. They swarmed, tightening their grip around me, forcing me to the floor. I could feel their cold tendrils slithering across my skin, sinking into my veins. They wanted to take me. They wanted to consume me, to make me a part of the darkness that had already claimed Matt. But I fought back. With every ounce of strength, every last shred of willpower, I pushed against the darkness. I focused on the door, the only way out. I didn't know if it was real or if it was just another trick, but it was all I had left. I crawled toward it, dragging my body through the suffocating weight of the air, through the twisting, oppressive shadows. The house groaned around me, its walls trembling as if it were alive, fighting to keep me trapped. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I reached the door. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps slow, deliberate, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't far now. I didn't have much time. I grabbed the door handle, my fingers numb and trembling, and yanked it open. For a moment, nothing happened. The air was still. I couldn't see anything beyond the door, just blackness stretching endlessly in front of me. But then, a crack of light appeared, just a sliver, and the darkness recoiled from it like it had been burned. I stepped through, and then, everything changed. The house was gone. The hallway, the basement, the shadows, they all vanished in an instant. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe. I looked around, disoriented, but I was outside. The cool night air filled my lungs, and the stars above shone brightly, as if mocking the horror I had just escaped. I was free, but as I stood there, my heart still racing, something felt off. I turned slowly, and in the distance, I saw it. The house. It stood there, just as it had been before. But now, it was far worse. It was darker, more twisted, its windows like empty eyes staring out at me. I could feel it calling to me. I could feel the darkness still lingering, waiting for me to return. The whispering had stopped, but I knew it wasn't gone. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to pull me back into its grip. I wanted to run. I wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. But something stopped me. Matt's face flashed in my mind. That last, pleading look. Let it in. I realized, with growing horror, that the house would never let me go. Not truly. The entity had taken Matt. It had taken so many before him, and it would take countless more. And now, it was waiting for me to return, to open that door once again, to give in, to let it back inside. I looked at the house one last time, and for the first time, I understood what it was. It wasn't just a place. It was a curse, a trap, and I was its latest victim. I didn't know if I could ever escape it, if I could ever truly be free. But one thing was clear, I would never forget.
The last tale of terror fades into the dark recesses of the mind, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. But be warned, what comes next is not for the faint of heart. Brace yourself as we delve into the twisted mind of a killer whose reality is anything but normal. The Puppeteer begins now. The Puppeteer. They never see me coming. Not really. They might sense a shift in the air, a fleeting shadow in their peripheral vision, but by the time they turn to look, I'm already gone. Or worse, I'm already there. To them, I'm just a face in the crowd, a harmless man, the kind you'd pass on the street and forget in an instant. I like it that way. People are drawn to what's familiar, and familiarity makes them careless. They'll laugh at my jokes, trust my small talk, and offer a polite smile as I slip past them. They never realize that while they're staring into my eyes, I'm dissecting them, layer by fragile layer. It's not the act of killing that I crave. No, that would be too simple, too crude. It's the moment before, the quiet tension, the sweet anticipation, like pulling back the strings of a marionette, feeling their resistance. There's nothing like that first twitch of fear, the moment they realize they're no longer the one in control. The first one wasn't supposed to happen. I was young, naive. It was an accident, or at least that's what I told myself. She was kind to me, her smile like sunlight breaking through my storm. But she didn't understand. She didn't see the cracks, the dark places I tried to keep hidden. She reached too far, too fast. So I silenced her. My hands around her throat felt so natural, so perfect, like the strings of a puppet winding around my fingers. After that, the world changed. Or maybe I did. Faces began to blur, colors dimmed. People looked like mannequins, hollow, breakable things. Their voices buzzed in my ears like flies. I started to see the strings everywhere tangled around their limbs, pulling them this way and that. I wondered who was pulling mine. The second one was deliberate. I chose her carefully, a college student, always rushing, always looking down at her phone. She didn't even notice me following her. I remember the sound of her heels clicking on the pavement, like a metronome ticking down the seconds to her final breath. She fought, of course. They always do. But it's never enough. Once I had her pinned, I looked into her eyes and saw it, the spark of defiance fading the moment she realized she was mine. The strings went slack, and she crumpled like a discarded marionette. I kept her in my workshop for a while. I needed time to understand her, to untangle her threads. She became part of my collection, each one a story, a moment frozen in time. I like to think I give them purpose, something more meaningful than the dull routines they followed in life. People call me a monster, if only they could see the truth. I don't destroy, I create. I take their broken lives and weave them into something beautiful, something eternal. The police are getting closer now. I see them in my dreams, faceless figures with their hands outstretched, trying to sever my strings. But they don't understand. You can't catch the puppeteer if you don't know the stage. Tonight, I've chosen my next. She works late at the diner on 5th Street, always wiping down the same counter with a tired smile. I watch her through the window, imagining the threads pulling her every move. I wonder what her story will be, how she'll fit into my masterpiece. As I step into the diner, she looks up and greets me with that same weary smile. She doesn't see the strings wrapping around her, doesn't feel the weight of my gaze, but she will. She always does. The shadows of our last story fade, but the unease lingers in the air. Now, we shift to a chilling account of the unknown, a tale of alien abduction based on unsettling claims from real events. Prepare yourself as we delve into the unexplainable. The night they took me. It started with a hum, low, mechanical, like an engine far in the distance. I didn't think much of it at first. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me, trying to will myself to sleep. It was just after midnight, and the small farmhouse I'd rented for the summer was silent except for the occasional chirp of crickets outside. The hum grew louder, though, and soon I could feel it. It wasn't just a sound. It was a vibration in my chest, in my bones, like standing too close to a massive speaker. My hands trembled as I threw off the covers and sat up. When I glanced out the window, everything looked wrong. The moon hung unnaturally low, casting an eerie silver light over the cornfields. The wind had stopped and the crickets had gone silent. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, suffocating, unnatural. And then I saw it, a light, impossibly bright, hovering above the tree line. It pulsed rhythmically, almost like it was breathing. I told myself it was a plane, or a drone, or some kind of equipment from the neighboring farms. But deep down, I knew better. Something about it was off. I don't remember deciding to go outside. One moment I was by the window, the next I was standing barefoot on the grass, staring up at the light. It was closer now, and I could see its shape, an enormous disc-like object, matte black except for the glowing ring of lights along its edge. It hovered soundlessly, defying gravity, and every hair on my body stood on end. I wanted to run, to hide, to do anything but stand there like a deer in headlights. But I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground, my arms limp at my sides. And then the beam hit me. It wasn't like light. It was tangible, like being submerged in water. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My entire body was weightless, suspended in the column of light as it lifted me off the ground. The world below me blurred into a swirl of green and black, and the last thing I remember was the cold, sterile smell of ozone before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was on a table. The room was stark, blindingly white, with no visible walls or ceiling, just an endless expanse of light. I couldn't tell where the glow was coming from. It seemed to radiate from everywhere at once. I wasn't alone. They stood around me, their bodies impossibly thin, their skin a dull gray that seemed to absorb the light. Their heads were oversized, with no hair, No ears, just smooth domes that glistened faintly, but it was their eyes that froze me, their enormous pitch-black eyes, like two voids that threatened to swallow me whole. They didn't speak, not with words anyway, but I could feel them in my mind, like whispers skittering across the surface of my thoughts. They were curious, analytical, as though I were some strange specimen they'd stumbled upon. I couldn't move. Straps held my arms and legs in place, though they didn't seem necessary. My body felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the beam had drained me of all strength. One of them stepped closer, its long, spindly fingers tracing a line down my forearm. The touch was ice cold, and I felt a sharp, burning pain as something punctured my skin. I craned my neck to see a thin, metallic instrument withdrawing a sliver of flesh. My screams were silent, swallowed by the endless whiteness. They worked with mechanical precision, poking, prodding, extracting samples from my body as though I were nothing more than an animal on a laboratory table. At one point, a needle as long as my forearm was lowered toward my eye, and I thought for sure I would die. But I didn't. As suddenly as it had started, it was over. I woke up in the cornfield, drenched in sweat and shaking uncontrollably. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the stalks, and the hum was gone. At first, I thought it had been a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying dream brought on by stress or exhaustion. But then I saw the marks. Small, circular burns dotted my forearm where the instrument had pierced my skin. A strange, geometric scar had appeared on my abdomen, faint but unmistakable. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was all in my head. But the memories wouldn't fade. The coldness of their touch, the black void of their eyes, the feeling of being utterly helpless, it haunted me. I kept to myself after that, avoiding the townsfolk and their polite but prying questions. The few times I ventured into town, I noticed something strange. People stared at me, not out of suspicion or malice, but as though they sensed something different, something wrong. It's been years now, but I still don't sleep well. The hum returns sometimes, faint but unmistakable, and I lie awake, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the beam to come again. I know they're not done with me. They never are.
As the echoes of our previous tale fade, a new shadow emerges, a harrowing account of a battle between light and darkness. This time, we delve into the chilling story of a real exorcism, a confrontation with an evil that defies comprehension. Brace yourself for an experience that will test the boundaries of your courage. It started in the quiet town of St. Martin, a place where the days seemed to linger and the nights came alive with the hum of cicadas. The Wilkes family had lived there for generations, their modest farmhouse nestled in a valley surrounded by sprawling fields and dense woods. To the neighbors, they were ordinary folk, kind, hardworking, and unremarkable. But in the summer of 1998, everything changed. The first sign was subtle. Anna, the youngest of the Wilkes children, began talking about the man in the corner. She was 8 years old, a bright and imaginative girl, and her parents initially dismissed it as a figment of her imagination. "He comes at night," she whispered to her mother one evening, clutching her teddy bear. "He doesn't like it when I pray." Her mother, Margaret, smiled and kissed her forehead. "It's just a bad dream, sweetheart. Say your prayers, and you'll be fine." But as the weeks passed, Anna's behavior grew more unsettling. She refused to sleep in her room, claiming the man whispered to her, saying horrible things no child should know. By August, Anna's condition had worsened. She became withdrawn, refusing to eat or speak, and her once vibrant eyes seemed hollow, as though something had drained the life from her. Her parents tried everything: doctors, counselors, even a trip to a child psychologist in the city. But no one could explain the sudden change in their daughter. Then came the night of the storm. The wind howled through the valley, rattling the windows of the farmhouse. Margaret woke to the sound of Anna screaming, a guttural, inhuman wail that froze her blood. She and her husband, Thomas, raced to Anna's room, only to find her standing in the corner, her tiny body contorted unnaturally. Her head jerked toward them, and for a moment, Margaret could swear Anna's eyes gleamed an otherworldly black. "She's ours," Anna growled, her voice layered, as though a chorus of voices spoke through her. Then she collapsed, her body limp and motionless. They called Father Bernard the next morning. Father Bernard had served the town for over 30 years. A man of unwavering faith, he was known for his compassion and his wisdom. But even he hesitated when Margaret and Thomas described what had happened. "Evil is real," he said gravely, "but it is rare. Are you certain this is not something else?" "We've tried everything," Margaret sobbed. "Please, Father. She's our little girl. We're losing her." The priest agreed to visit the farmhouse that evening, bringing with him a Bible, a bottle of holy water, and a rosary. When he entered Anna's room, the air felt heavy, oppressive. The once bright space now seemed cloaked in shadow, and the faint smell of sulfur lingered in the air. Anna lay in bed, her eyes half open, staring blankly at the ceiling. As Father Bernard approached, she let out a low, guttural laugh. "You won't help them," she said, her voice cold and unrecognizable. "She belongs to us," Margaret gasped, clutching her husband's arm. "Anna," she pleaded, "please, baby, it's Mommy." But the thing in the bed was not Anna. The priest began to pray, his voice steady despite the fear tightening in his chest. He sprinkled holy water over the bed, and Anna screamed, thrashing violently as though in agony. Her screams grew louder, reverberating through the house, until the walls seemed to vibrate. Then, with a deafening crack, the crucifix on the wall shattered, and silence fell. Father Bernard turned to the terrified parents. "This is beyond me," he said, his face pale. "We need the church's intervention." It took weeks to get approval for an official exorcism. During that time, Anna's condition worsened. She spoke in tongues, her voice shifting between languages she could not possibly know. Her body bore inexplicable marks, scratches and bruises that appeared overnight. Furniture moved on its own, and at night, the family heard footsteps pacing outside their bedroom doors. When the exorcist finally arrived, he was not what they expected. Father Matthias was a frail, elderly man with piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight into your soul. He entered the farmhouse with quiet determination, carrying an ancient leather-bound book and a look of grim resolve. The exorcism began at dusk. Father Matthias stood at the foot of Anna's bed, flanked by Father Bernard and a young deacon. Margaret and Thomas were instructed to stay in the next room, but Margaret refused, clutching her rosary as she knelt by the doorway. The prayers began, a steady rhythm of Latin verses that filled the room like a rising tide. At first, Anna lay still, her eyes shut, her breathing shallow. But as the prayers intensified, so did her reaction. Her body convulsed, her back arching off the bed in impossible angles. Her screams were unearthly, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the very foundation of the house. "You think you can save her?" The voice snarled, louder than before. "She is ours. You are nothing." The room grew colder, frost forming on the windows despite the summer heat. The lights flickered, and shadows danced across the walls, shapes that did not belong to anyone present. Father Matthias did not waver. He pressed the crucifix to Anna's forehead, and she howled in pain. "In the name of Jesus Christ," he commanded, his voice firm, "I order you to leave this child. Be gone, foul spirit, and return to the abyss." Anna's body bucked violently, her eyes rolling back in her head. For a moment, it seemed the entity was weakening. But then, with a deafening roar, the bed lifted off the ground, slamming back down with a force that shook the room. Margaret screamed, but Father Matthias raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Do not give it power," he warned, his voice calm but resolute. The battle raged for hours, the demon taunting them with cruel words, speaking in voices that mimicked loved ones, whispering secrets no one else could know. But Father Matthias did not relent. He recited scripture, his voice unwavering even as objects flew across the room and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. The sweat poured down Father Matthias's brow, his hands trembling as he clutched the holy water, the glass now slick with the force of his grip. The room seemed to pulse with a malevolent heartbeat, the shadows shifting in ways that defied natural law. With every prayer he spoke, the demon hissed, its voice grating and filled with a deep, guttural rage that seemed to rip through the very fabric of reality. "Why do you resist?" The demon sneered, its voice slipping through the room like a blade. "I will break you, priest." Father Matthias's lips quivered, but his eyes, once filled with doubt, now blazed with a fierce determination. The floor beneath his feet cracked, splintering in jagged lines that reached out like clawed fingers. He could feel the cold seep into his bones, the dark power pushing against his will, but he stood his ground. "Begone, unholy spirit," he shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion but resolute. He cast the holy water over the possessed woman, the liquid shimmering in the dim light as it splashed across her skin, and she shrieked, the sound a mixture of agony and rage. For a brief moment, her contorted face slackened, eyes rolling back as if the demon was retreating. But only for a heartbeat. Then it came back, stronger. Her body arched, the muscles convulsing with unnatural force. Her voice dropped in pitch, resonating with the weight of centuries. "You think you can banish me?" It snarled, the voice now deep and fractured, echoing as if 100 voices spoke at once. Father Matthias closed his eyes and prayed with every ounce of his soul, drawing on the strength of his faith, the centuries of tradition that had forged him. His words blurred into a rhythmic chant, each syllable imbued with power, carrying a force that pushed against the suffocating darkness. The room trembled, and in that moment, Father Matthias felt a coldness rush through him, an unnatural chill that threatened to freeze the blood in his veins. But he did not waver. The possessed woman's screams became deafening, a symphony of agony that made his ears ring. Suddenly, a sound broke through, soft at first, but growing steadily louder. It was the sound of whispers, 1,000 murmurs that seemed to swirl in the air, pleading, yearning, and full of suffering. It was then that Father Matthias understood. These were the voices of those who had been claimed before her, their souls crying out for liberation. The demon screeched, a sound that split the silence and made the hairs on Father Matthias's neck stand on end. The possessed woman's eyes shot open, and they glowed with an unnatural red light. She lunged forward, her hands reaching out like claws, fingers bent in a way that suggested they were more bone than flesh. "No!" Father Matthias roared, stepping forward with a final burst of energy. He took the crucifix from around his neck, pressing it to her forehead as he whispered the exorcism's final words. The room became a blinding burst of light, and for a moment, he could see nothing but the searing brilliance. Then, silence. The glow faded, and the room was still. The woman's eyes fluttered shut, her body limp as if she were finally at rest. The air seemed to lose its suffocating weight, and the shadows that had clawed at the corners retreated. Father Matthias fell to his knees, gasping for breath, the holy water now pooling around him, a testament to his victory and exhaustion. The possessed woman awoke moments later, her eyes wide with confusion and fear, but no longer red and unearthly. Her gaze met his, tearful and hollow, as if a lifetime of horror had left its mark on her soul. "It's over," Father Matthias whispered, though the echo of the demon's voice still lingered, like an insidious shadow waiting for the next opening. The night was far from over, but in that moment, he knew that whatever had come next, he would be ready. Father Matthias sat on the cold, wooden floor, feeling the weight of the last few hours settle on his shoulders like a shroud. The room was quiet now, the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the cracked blinds and casting pale streaks across the battered walls. The air was still tainted with the scent of decay, but the presence that had once suffocated it was now absent, as if it had been dragged back into the dark corners of the earth from whence it came. The woman, Maria, lay sprawled across the floor, her breathing ragged but even, the tension in her face slowly giving way to exhaustion. She looked up at him, eyes wide, tears slipping down her cheeks. The horror of what had happened was etched in her expression, but there was a faint glimmer of relief, of hope, as if she had just emerged from a nightmare that threatened to consume her entirely. "Father, what happened?" Maria's voice was hoarse, weak, as if she hadn't spoken in days. He swallowed, the taste of bitterness still heavy in his mouth. "You were possessed, Maria. But it's over now. You're safe." A shudder passed through her, and she reached out, her fingers brushing the hem of his robe. I remember. The priest gently took her hand, a rare tenderness breaking through his exhaustion. You don't have to remember everything. Rest now. But the room, as peaceful as it seemed, wasn't without its secrets. The whispers were still there, barely audible, like echoes that refused to die. He had felt it in the moment the possession broke, an unsettling, lingering force that seemed to breathe behind the walls. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, half expecting to see dark, inhuman shapes watching from the shadows. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. The sudden sound was sharp, invasive, and in that moment, the stale air seemed to grow colder. Maria's eyes locked with his, her pupils flaring with the kind of terror that only comes when one realizes the danger has not truly passed. He stood slowly, drawing himself up to his full height and feeling the weight of the crucifix pressed against his chest. "Stay here," he said, his voice low and strained. Maria nodded, her fingers clutching at the hem of her shirt, the tips of her nails white with tension. Another knock. The sound cut through the room like an accusation. Father Matthias stepped forward, heart thundering in his chest as he reached for the doorknob. The air was so still, it felt as though the entire world had been holding its breath. He opened the door, half expecting to see nothing but the empty hall, or maybe an innocent parishioner who had come with questions, unaware of the horrors that had just taken place. But it wasn't empty. A figure stood there, shrouded in a long, dark coat. Its head was lowered, obscuring its face, but even in the low light, Father Matthias could see the sharp, bony fingers that clutched a wooden staff. The silence stretched long and thin, a warning before the storm. "Father Matthias," the figure rasped, its voice hoarse and unfamiliar. "It is not over." He stiffened, a chill spreading through his body as the shadows behind the figure seemed to writhe. The very air around him grew colder, and that metallic taste of fear returned to his mouth. "It will never be over," the figure continued, raising its head to reveal eyes that glowed with an unnatural, crimson light, eyes that were not human. Father Matthias's hand reached for the crucifix, but it was already too late. The figure stepped forward, and the room was swallowed by darkness, the air crackling with an energy so vile it made his skin crawl. And in that moment, he knew he was no longer fighting just one battle. He was standing at the edge of an abyss, and it was staring back at him. The air thickened around him, pressing in on his chest like an unseen weight. Father Matthias took a step back, his fingers tightening around the crucifix until the sharp edge cut into his palm. The figure stepped inside, the cloak trailing like smoke behind it, and with each movement, the air seemed to warp, shivering with an unnatural energy. "Who are you?" His voice was steadier than he felt, but the tremor in his legs betrayed him. The figure did not answer immediately. It tilted its head, the shadows around it moving as if alive. A cruel smile stretched across its lips, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too yellowed. "You know who I am, Father," it said, the voice low and hypnotic, each syllable slicing through the silence like a blade. "And you know what's to come." Father Matthias glanced back at Maria, who cowered against the wall, her eyes wide with the kind of terror that paralyzes. The whispers were louder now, a chorus of agony that made his ears ring. He knew then that the demon he had cast out was not alone, that the battle he had fought had been only the first round in an ongoing war. The figure took another step forward, and the room seemed to warp around it, stretching and twisting as if it were a living thing. The walls cracked, and the ceiling groaned under the weight of something unseen, something that wanted to break free. "Please, Father," Maria whispered, her voice shaking as the darkness spread through the room. "What do we do?" He had no answer, but he knew he had to act fast. He lifted the crucifix higher, its silver glinting in the moonlight, and spoke the words that had protected generations of priests. The ancient exorcism prayer, spoken in Latin. The words tumbled out of him, raw and desperate, carrying the power of 1,000 years of faith. The figure flinched, its smile twisting in pain as if struck by an unseen blow. It staggered back, and the darkness around it shrieked, pulling back as though burned by the light. The room shuddered, and the whispers rose into a deafening cacophony that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of his bones. You cannot banish me. The figure roared, voice distorted by fury and anguish. Not here, not now. Be gone, spirit of darkness. Father Matthias roared back, pushing the crucifix forward, the sharp edge of its cross pressing into the space between them. The figure's eyes met his, and in them, he saw 100 ancient souls, twisted and broken. But there was something else, something more powerful. A promise. It would not be the end, and it would not be the last time this darkness would come for them. A flash of silver light exploded around them, the force of it shoving Father Matthias to the ground. The crucifix slipped from his fingers, and the room seemed to split into a dozen pieces, light and shadow twisting in an impossible dance. When the light died down, the figure was gone. The room was silent again, but the echoes of the battle lingered. Father Matthias struggled to his feet, eyes scanning the room. Maria lay still, her eyes shut tight, a thin line of blood tracing her temple. He reached for her, heart racing with fear and guilt. "Maria, are you okay?" Her eyes fluttered open, but there was no recognition in them, only a vacant stare that made him recoil. And then he heard it again, the whispers, fainter this time, but unmistakable. The voice of the demon, still present but hidden, waiting for the next time it could strike. Father Matthias knew then that this was not the end. It was only the beginning. He stood there, the silence almost deafening, as the realization sank in. This wasn't over. The demon's promise was no idle threat. It was a prophecy, and the room, the house, the entire world outside was under its shadow. The whispers were a thread, a hint of the malign spirit waiting to find its way back. The question was not if, but when. Father Matthias bent down, cradling Maria's head in his hands. Her eyes finally focused on him, a flicker of recognition breaking through the haze. The tear tracks on her face were dry now, and her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came out. He squeezed her hand gently, trying to convey that she was safe for now. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, more to himself than to her. The weight of his voice was heavy, burdened with the knowledge that whatever force had come into this world had not been banished but merely sent away, retreating into the dark until it could plot its return. The floor creaked under his feet as he helped Maria up. She swayed, a fragile shadow of herself, and leaned into him for support. Father Matthias looked around the room, noting the damage, the deep gashes in the walls, the shattered glass of the broken lamp, the scars of their struggle. It was an almost surreal sight, like something out of a waking nightmare. "Father, what happens now?" Maria finally managed, her voice cracked and small. He wanted to give her an answer that would ease her fear, but words failed him. "We prepare," he said instead, the resolve in his voice feeling thin and brittle. "We prepare, and we wait, and we fight." Outside, the sky was a solid expanse of black, an unbroken sea of night that stretched out into eternity. The city beyond the house was asleep, oblivious to the darkness that had almost consumed it. Father Matthias could not help but feel that, in that moment, a subtle shift had taken place. A veil had been lifted, revealing what had always existed behind it. The unseen, the unspeakable. They made their way to the front door, the weight of silence pressing down on them. Each step was punctuated by the soft creak of the wooden floor, and the cold draft that seeped in from outside seemed to breathe across his skin, chilling him to the bone. As they stepped out onto the porch, the first rays of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, a pale wash of gray cutting through the night. Father Matthias closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the light wash over him. It was fragile, almost timid in its arrival, but it was a promise, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, light could still pierce through. But deep in the stillness, a sound so faint it was nearly imperceptible reached his ears. A low, whispering laughter that twisted and turned like a snake in the grass. He opened his eyes and turned, his heart clenching tight as he scanned the dark, empty room. It was back. The cold morning breeze seeped through the gaps in the door, bringing with it a sense of emptiness and desolation. Father Matthias turned to Maria, who was still trembling, and their eyes met in a moment that seemed eternal. The shadows inside the house writhed as if they had a life of their own, and the daylight that barely touched the dark corners felt inadequate against the blackness that was still lingering. "There's something else," he whispered, his voice sounding weaker than he intended. It wasn't just the echo of the demon, but the promise of something bigger, something that stretched beyond them, beyond the city, something that was only just beginning. The sound of the wind grew, a hiss that rose and fell as if the house itself were breathing. Maria, her face pale and eyes wide with fear, pulled away from him. "What does it mean, Father? What's coming?" He didn't know. Father Matthias's hands tightened into fists as he tried to steady his breathing. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with the stench of decay that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. The demon had been banished, at least for now, but the house had been scarred, marked by the presence that had dwelled within it. "We need to move," Matthias said, finally breaking the silence. "The danger isn't over." Maria glanced nervously at the broken furniture and shattered glass, at the dark streaks smeared across the floor like remnants of an ancient ritual. The memories of the night flooded back, the whispers, the unnatural strength, the clawed hands that had tried to drag her into darkness. She shivered, pressing a hand to her chest as if to steady her racing heart. "Father, where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Matthias looked around, the sense of urgency prickling at his skin. They needed safety, not just from the lingering threat of the demon, but from the unknown force that had been awakened. The silence in the house was deceptive. It felt like the calm before a storm. "There is a place," Matthias said, his voice taking on an edge of determination. "A sanctuary. It's hidden, but it may be our only hope." The wind howled again, the sound sharper this time, like a scream torn from the depths of the earth. Maria felt her blood run cold. The demon had been banished, but whatever had bound it here was not gone. It was watching, waiting. "Then let's go," Maria urged, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting the shadows to move. The house seemed to lean in toward them, as though it, too, wanted to resist their departure. Matthias nodded and moved towards the door, but before he could reach for the handle, a voice slithered through the silence, one that was familiar and foreign at the same time. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice was distorted, a blend of malice and mockery. Matthias turned, eyes locked on the center of the room where the air seemed to shimmer and twist. A shape began to take form, shifting like smoke but with eyes that burned as if they held a flame. "No," Matthias whispered, stepping in front of Maria. He raised his hands, not as a shield but as a challenge. "You will not take her." The creature laughed, a sound that echoed as if a dozen voices were speaking in unison. It moved closer, tendrils of darkness reaching out, brushing past Matthias as if testing him. "You think you can stand against the dark," it hissed. "You know nothing of what is coming." The air grew colder, and Matthias felt the weight of his own doubts pressing against him. He glanced at Maria, who stood frozen, eyes wide with terror. He had to end this, once and for all. In a sudden burst of courage, Matthias lunged forward, chanting the prayer that had first brought him here. The room seemed to shudder, and the creature recoiled as if burned by an invisible flame. Its form flickered and twisted, the darkness splintering like glass. "Leave this place," Matthias shouted. The shadows shrieked and shattered, the last remnants pulled back into the center of the room before vanishing into nothingness. A silence followed, so deep and complete that it seemed to swallow the world. Maria exhaled, her breath shaking, her eyes wide as she realized the danger had passed, at least for now. Matthias lowered his hands, exhaustion sinking into his bones. "It's done," he said, voice barely audible. But Maria's relief was fleeting. The silence that followed was unnatural, heavy with the sense of something lurking just out of reach. The shadows in the corners seemed to hold their breath, waiting. And then came a sound, a low, guttural growl that resonated from the walls, from the floor beneath their feet, as if the house itself were alive. Matthias spun around, eyes narrowing as the darkness in the room shifted. The air felt charged, almost electric, crackling with a malevolence that went beyond anything he'd faced before. He clenched his fists, fighting the rising dread that threatened to consume him. "Father, what is it?" Maria asked, her voice small and trembling. She backed away until she bumped into the wall, as if expecting it to move and swallow her whole. "Something's wrong," Matthias muttered, eyes scanning the room. The shadows seemed to coil and unfurl, reaching out like the fingers of 1,000 unseen hands. He could hear whispers now, murmurs that were both familiar and foreign, repeating fragments of old prayers and the names of the saints. "Leave," a voice rasped, not the mocking tone of the demon but something deeper, more ancient. "You will not be spared." Suddenly, the room exploded in a cacophony of noise, crashing furniture, glass shattering, the wind roaring as if a storm had erupted inside the house. The floor beneath them cracked, a jagged line splitting across the old wood, sending a shudder through their feet. Maria screamed as the darkness thickened, coalescing into a form that defied comprehension. It was as if reality itself had fractured, revealing a creature made of pure shadow and malice. Its eyes were two burning orbs, piercing through the veil of space between them. Matthias knew that it was no longer just a demon, no longer something he could contain with holy words alone. This was an entity, an ancient force, and it had come to claim them. He stepped forward, holding the crucifix aloft, his voice unwavering as he recited the exorcism with a desperation that cut through the chaos. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." But the creature did not flinch. It moved with a fluid grace that made it seem almost human, yet its limbs were elongated, unnatural. Its mouth opened, revealing a jagged row of teeth that seemed to gnash and twist with each sound it made. "Your faith is weak," it whispered, and for the first time, Matthias felt fear seep into his bones, cold and unrelenting. The creature lunged, and Matthias barely managed to sidestep, falling hard to the ground as a clawed hand passed just inches from his face. He scrambled to his knees, breath coming in ragged gasps, eyes wide as he realized that Maria was no longer behind him. "Maria," he shouted, spinning around to find her. She stood at the far end of the room, staring at the creature with an expression that was both horrified and entranced. "Help her!" Matthias roared, reaching out, but his words were lost in the noise. The creature turned its gaze upon him, eyes narrowing, as if it understood the bond they shared, and then it spoke again. "You cannot save her." A surge of desperation took hold of Matthias. He lunged forward, pushing against the suffocating darkness with every ounce of strength he had left. The room erupted in a final blaze of light as the crucifix in his hand flared with an intensity that made the air shiver. The creature let out a sound that was more a screech of rage than anything resembling human speech, and as the light consumed it, it let out a final, bone-chilling cry. The shadows recoiled, dissipating into nothingness, taking the creature with them. The silence that followed was so profound it felt like a tangible weight pressing down on Matthias's chest. He stood there, eyes wide, body trembling as he tried to comprehend what had just happened. Maria's voice broke the silence, small and weak. "Father, it's over." Matthias turned to find her kneeling on the floor, her eyes swollen with tears. The room was still in disarray, but the oppressive weight of the darkness was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. He nodded, but it was clear that the scars left by what had occurred would be deep and lasting. "It's over," he said, but the words felt hollow. In the quiet aftermath, he realized that whatever had been unleashed was not truly defeated. It had only retreated, waiting for the next time it could claim its due. But for now, they had survived. And that was enough.
The following story contains elements of psychological horror and suspense, inspired by tales of isolation and the unknown. As we delve into this narrative, be prepared for a journey where reality blurs with the unexplainable, and the boundaries of sanity are tested. This is a tale of fear that takes root in the familiar and grows into something unimaginable. The storm had raged for hours, battering the small cabin perched on the edge of the forest like a beast clawing at its prey. Nathan's pulse thudded in his ears as he strained to hear anything beyond the roar of the wind and the crackle of the fire. The flickering light cast shadows that seemed to twitch and move, almost as if they had a life of their own. "It's just the storm," he muttered, his voice thin and shaky, attempting to calm himself. His leg throbbed where the metal shrapnel had pierced his flesh, a dull, relentless ache that blurred the line between pain and numbness. The crash that had sent him sprawling into the underbrush had broken something inside him, but he had made it here, to this forsaken place. The battered cabin had been a solitary refuge, but now it felt like a tomb. A creak from the floorboards made him stiffen. He glanced nervously toward the kitchen door, half expecting to see someone standing there. He knew better, though. It was just the wind, he told himself again. But as the wind shrieked louder, so did the fear gnawing at his insides. "You're not alone, Nathan," a voice whispered. A voice that didn't belong to him, not to anyone. It slithered into the room from somewhere just out of sight, familiar and unfamiliar all at once. His throat tightened, and his eyes darted around the room, seeking out the source. Who's there?" His voice trembled, barely audible over the cacophony outside. No response came, only the silence stretching between the pulses of the storm, making him feel as though he were being watched, trapped. The whisper returned, closer this time. "You shouldn't be here, Nathan. You shouldn't have come back." He stumbled to his feet, pain stabbing up his leg as he grabbed the nearest object, a cast-iron skillet. He held it like a weapon, eyes wide, heart hammering as the fire's light danced over the room. But the cabin was empty. The shadowy corners mocked him with their silence. Nathan's breathing came in ragged gasps. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be. A sudden thud from behind him sent him whirling around, skillet raised, but it was only a stack of old magazines toppling to the floor. His chest heaved as he took in the sight, sweat slicking his temples, blinding him with a mixture of terror and relief. But then he heard it, the soft shuffle of feet. It was unmistakable, the sound of boots dragging across the floor, heavy and deliberate. His fingers tightened around the skillet, and he took a half-step forward. A silhouette appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, framed by the pale moonlight that seeped through the cracked window. A woman stood there, her face obscured by shadow, but her presence was suffocating. The smell of damp earth and something else, something rancid, began to fill the room. "You never should have come here," she said, voice low and raspy. "Not after what you did." His mind reeled, memories flashing like old film reels. A crash, a scream, a plea for mercy that had ended in silence. The forest, the blood, the way he had left her behind. She had been a casualty in his failed attempt to survive. "Please, He started, but the woman's head snapped up, and he saw her face for the first time. Hollow eyes, sunken cheeks, a smile that revealed teeth stained black and broken. "There's no forgiveness, Nathan," she whispered, and the last thing he saw was her hand reaching toward him, nails jagged as bone, before everything went dark. The storm raged on, but it was no longer just the wind. When the authorities arrived the next morning, the cabin was still. The fire had burned out, leaving behind a chilling, unnatural cold. No sign of Nathan, only the echoes of the whispered words, "You shouldn't have come back."
After a long series of harrowing tales, we move on to another story that delves into the eerie and unsettling corners of folklore. This tale will make you rethink the joy of the season, as the line between Christmas cheer and chilling terror blurs in unexpected ways. The snow fell thick and silent, cloaking the town in a pristine, blinding white that muffled all sound. It was Christmas Eve, but there was no joy in the air. There was only the smell of pine and the distant, bitter cold wind howling like a specter through the woods that surrounded the village. In the heart of this silence stood the old manor, abandoned for generations, its twisted spires cutting into the grey sky like gnarled fingers. The townsfolk whispered that the manor was cursed, but young Elias, with his untamed curiosity and a heart full of defiance, dared to enter it. He had grown tired of the endless stories his father told. Stories of strange figures that would appear on Christmas night, bearing gifts that were anything but festive. They said the manor's doors would open on their own, the walls would moan, and shadows with eyes like coal would flicker in the corners of the rooms. It was the old bell at the top of the manor's tower that had called him. Every year on Christmas Eve, it chimed at midnight, as if a hand unseen were pulling its rope, and every year, the townspeople would shudder and pull their curtains tighter. But this year, Elias stood in the snow with the bitter wind biting at his neck, daring the chimes to ring. As he pushed open the iron gate, rust flaked off in brittle sheets, like the skin of a long-dead thing. The front door, heavy and unyielding, creaked open without resistance, as though it had been expecting him. Inside, the air was musty and suffocating, laden with dust and an old, sour scent that seemed to whisper of decay. He lit a match, the flame flickering and casting long, menacing shadows across the cobwebbed walls. The house held its breath, waiting. Then, the floorboards creaked above him, and a cold draft blew down the hallway. Elias spun around, his heart thundering in his chest. "Is anyone there?" he whispered, but the silence swallowed his voice whole. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a child's laugh, bright and sweet. The hair on his neck stood on end. He forced his feet to move, deeper into the darkness, following the laugh that led him to the grand dining hall, where a long table sat, draped in a deep red cloth, and decorated with candles that dripped black wax onto the floor. The scent of burning wax mixed with something metallic. Sitting at the table was a figure cloaked in crimson. Its face was hidden beneath a hood, but its bony fingers were wrapped around an ornament that glistened with a sickly, unnatural sheen. "Welcome," the figure said, its voice hollow as if coming from somewhere far away. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the shadows twisted and writhed. Elias froze, unable to move, the laugh ringing again, this time behind him, as if dozens of children were whispering secrets that no one should hear. The candle flames guttered, casting grotesque shapes across the walls. From the corners of the room, dark shapes emerged, small, malformed children with eyes that burned like embers, mouths twisted in silent, mocking glee. Elias knew then that he had stepped into a world where the Christmas spirit was not one of joy, but one of ancient, dark hunger. The manor was not a home, but a prison for lost souls, and tonight, on Christmas Eve, they would be free. He stumbled backward, his vision swimming as the figures lunged, laughter and shrieks filling the room as the darkness claimed him. The room seemed to melt around him, the cold seeping into his bones as Elias fell to his knees. The figures surrounding him closed in, their eyes flickering with an otherworldly light. The laughter intensified, sharp and piercing, like 1,000 tiny blades carving through the silence. Elias felt the icy grip of something unseen wrap around his throat, squeezing until he could no longer scream. A voice, ancient and guttural, echoed in the recesses of his mind, speaking in a language he could not understand, but its intent was clear. He was not just an intruder, he was prey. As the air grew colder, the shadows began to take form, coalescing into twisted shapes with limbs that bent at impossible angles. They whispered and chattered, their voices mingling with the wind, and Elias felt his sanity fraying at the edges. The crimson-robed figure leaned closer, revealing a face that was neither human nor beast. Skin as pale as bone, hollow eyes that seemed to devour him, and a mouth that split into a smile too wide to be natural. "Christmas is for the ones who remember," the figure said, its voice a chorus of echoes. The children's laughter swelled, now joined by the sound of tiny feet shuffling on the floor. Elias tried to crawl away, but the floor was slick with an oily substance that clung to his skin, pulling him back. His fingers scrabbled at the wood, leaving grooves in the dark veneer as he fought to escape. The dark figures reached for him, their limbs distorting and stretching as they moved, the air filled with the smell of burning pine and something sweet, almost sickly. Suddenly, a flash of golden light burst from the chandelier above, momentarily illuminating the room. The figures shrieked, recoiling as if scorched, their eyes blinking and flickering with the intensity of the glow. Elias dared a glance upward and saw the source, a star-shaped ornament that had come to life, pulsing with radiant warmth, the glow searing the shadows. A voice, gentle and familiar, whispered from within the glow. It was his mother's voice. "Run, Elias," she said. He was paralyzed by the sound, the warmth spreading through his limbs, lending him strength. His body moved of its own accord, muscles working against the cold, against the terror, against the figures that were now wailing, their forms dissolving into smoky, black vapor. Elias surged forward, stumbling over the slick floor, driven by the light and the voice that now rang in his ears, calling him home. Behind him, the figures coalesced again, their cries louder, more guttural. The crimson-robed figure rose, its bony hand reaching toward him, fingers elongated and claw-like. "You cannot leave," it rasped. "You belong to the night." The light intensified, casting long, golden rays across the hall, and for a brief, miraculous moment, the figures shrieked and vanished into the black corners of the room. Elias reached the front door, flinging it open to the bitter wind and moonlight. The snow glistened under the pale light, a stark contrast to the horror he had left behind. He ran into the night, not daring to look back, the voices still calling him from within the manor's decaying walls. But now, their cries were desperate, as if the night itself had been robbed of its prey. As he stumbled down the road, gasping for breath, the town came into view, quiet and untouched by the terror he had left behind. But when he dared to glance over his shoulder, the windows of the manor were illuminated, and behind them, countless faces peered out, eyes wide and mouths agape, their voices now reduced to a haunting whisper. Elias kept running, his heart pounding like a war drum, every step echoing in the cold silence. The wind whipped past him, stinging his face and carrying with it a distant, unnatural sound, a chorus of whispers that seemed to wrap around him like a shroud. It was as if the manor itself were breathing, sighing with the weight of its lost souls. He reached the edge of the forest, his vision blurred from exhaustion and tears. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal hands. He knew that if he ventured deeper, he might never find his way out. But the whispers behind him grew louder, insistent and filled with a chilling promise. Suddenly, he felt a tug at his coat, a sharp, icy grip that pulled him backward. He spun around, his eyes wide with terror, and for a heartbeat, he saw her. A girl with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched into a grin that cracked her pale, cracked skin. She moved in jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by some unseen hand. "You left us," she whispered, her voice a child's giggle twisted into something monstrous. Elias stumbled backward, slipping on the snow as the figure advanced, her fingers stretching, bending in ways that defied nature. He scrambled to his feet, pushing himself away from her, and the golden light from the manor flared once more, illuminating the night sky. The girl shrieked, retreating with the others into the dark woods. He ran, not caring if he lost his way, the echoes of the whispers mingling with the sound of his breath, heavy and broken. The laughter of children now seemed to come from every direction, dissonant and fragmented, wrapping around him, telling him he was not alone. A branch snapped behind him, and he spun around to find himself face to face with the crimson-robed figure. Its eyes, two pits of darkness, seemed to drink in his fear. "You cannot run from us," it rasped, its voice like the grinding of stone. Elias's vision swam, the edges of reality warping. The snow underfoot began to melt, the ground shifting into a slick, black liquid. He slipped, falling to his knees as the figure loomed over him, its presence suffocating, its grin wide and mocking. The girl appeared again, this time behind the crimson-robed figure. Her eyes met his, and in that moment, Elias knew she was not the only one. All around him, the figures gathered, their eyes glistening with a hunger that chilled him to his core. "Please, no," he whispered, crawling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The laughter rose, now mixed with sobs and screams. The figures reached out, their hands a flurry of shadows and claws. And then, silence. A sudden, unnatural stillness fell over the scene. The figures stopped, their eyes widening as they stared at the sky. Above, the stars flickered and shifted, forming shapes that were too intricate, too alive. A voice, deep and resonant, thundered through the forest, a sound so powerful that the very ground seemed to shudder. "Remember who you are," it said. The crimson-robed figure screamed, a sound that shattered the night, but before it could reach out, it dissolved into ash, scattering on the wind. The girl gasped, clutching at her chest before vanishing, her laughter fading into the quiet night. Elias lay on the snow, panting, his heart still drumming in his ears. The forest was still, the whispers gone. The moon, now full and silver, cast its cold light down on him as if nothing had happened. Yet, In the distance, he thought he saw movement, fleeting and dark, watching from the woods. He stood slowly, limbs trembling, and realized the snow around him had turned red, like the blood of something that had once been alive. He dared not turn back to the manor. The memory of those eyes, that grin, seared into him. But as he took one last, shaky step away, the wind carried a voice to him, soft and familiar, yet full of sorrow. "Elias, come back." He stopped, breathless, and turned his head toward the forest once more. And just for a moment, he saw her. The girl from the manor, her face no longer twisted, but full of pleading. And then, she vanished into the darkness.
As the last tale fades into its haunting conclusion, another unsettling story takes shape. Prepare yourself, for this one may linger in your thoughts long after the final word is read. The Wailing House. They called it the Wailing House. Perched atop Blackwood Hill, the decrepit mansion had loomed over the small town of Hollow Pines for more than a century. Every few years, whispers resurfaced about the cries heard emanating from its rotting walls, sounds of anguish, terror, and grief that carried across the cold night air. But it was just a legend, or so I thought, until I stood in front of its yawning gates one freezing October evening. It began with a dare. My best friend, Alex, had always been the reckless one. $100 says you can't spend the night in there, he said, smirking as he pointed at the decaying structure. We'd been walking home from a Halloween party, the town's streets eerily silent beneath the pale glow of a waning moon. I should have said no. The house seemed to groan as I pushed open the rusted gate, its hinges screeching in protest. Overgrown weeds and dead ivy clung to the walls like skeletal fingers, and the windows, shattered and caked with grime, resembled hollow eyes. Alex handed me a flashlight and a bottle of cheap whiskey, slapping me on the back with a nervous laugh. "See you at dawn," he said, though I noticed his voice trembled. The door was unlocked, swinging inward with a dry creak that made my skin crawl. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. The beam of my flashlight flickered over warped floorboards, peeling wallpaper, and furniture shrouded in dusty sheets. "Just a house," I muttered to myself. But it wasn't just a house. The first hour passed uneventfully. I set up camp in what might have once been a sitting room, settling onto an old sofa that sagged under my weight. The whiskey burned going down, its warmth chasing away the chill. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but the house itself remained eerily silent. It started around midnight. A faint sound, like someone dragging something heavy across the floor, echoed from upstairs. My pulse quickened as I strained to listen, convincing myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But then came the whispering. Indistinct and guttural, it seemed to seep from the walls themselves. My flashlight flickered again, casting strange, twisting shadows that danced across the room. I gripped the bottle tighter, my throat dry despite the alcohol. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The whispers stopped. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, descending the staircase at the end of the hall. I stumbled to my feet, heart hammering as I aimed the flashlight toward the doorway. The beam barely penetrated the darkness, but I could see movement, a figure, pale and gaunt, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. It wasn't walking, it was gliding. I bolted. The front door slammed shut as I reached it, the force of it knocking me backward. I scrambled to my feet, breath hitching as I turned to find the room empty. The figure was gone. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping in a cacophony of despair. My ears rang as I stumbled down the hall, desperate to find another way out. A door to my right creaked open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. Every instinct screamed at me to stay away, but the sound of something scraping against the floor behind me left me no choice. The basement was worse. The air was colder, damp, and suffocating. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, some empty, others containing things I couldn't identify but that made my stomach churn. My flashlight caught the edge of a wooden table, its surface dark and sticky. And then I saw them, eyes, hundreds of them staring out from the darkness. They were embedded in the walls, unblinking, their pupils dilating as the light passed over them. A scream bubbled up in my throat, but it died as the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. A hand, skeletal and ice-cold, gripped my shoulder. I turned, but there was no one there. The last thing I remember is the eyes moving, shifting in their sockets as the walls began to close in. When they found me the next morning, I was lying in the field outside the house, clutching the flashlight with white-knuckled hands. Alex said he heard me screaming from the hilltop but couldn't bring himself to come inside. I don't know what I saw in that house, but I know one thing for certain. The wailing hasn't stopped. Not in the house, not in my dreams. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear it calling my name.
As one story fades, another emerges, darker and more insidious. This is a tale of vanity, obsession, and the terrifying lengths one might go to for the promise of beauty. Maria Fernanda had always been vain. In her youth, her flawless skin and enviable figure had opened doors that others could only dream of. But age was merciless, and at 57, the signs of passing years etched themselves into her face, her hands, and her once lustrous hair. What others saw as a natural part of life, she perceived as a tragedy. "There are no ugly women, only poor ones," she would often mutter to herself while examining the faint lines around her eyes in the mirror. Facials, the most expensive creams, Botox injections, none of it seemed to be enough. Youth was slipping away from her grasp like sand through her fingers, and her desperation grew with each passing day. It was on one of those sleepless nights, scrolling through the endless abyss of the internet, that she found it. Reclaim Your Youth, experimental procedure for total rejuvenation. No cost. Limited slots available. Her heart raced. The advertisement was sparse on details but boasted testimonials that seemed almost miraculous. Blurred photos of middle-aged faces transformed into younger, vibrant versions accompanied vague yet enticing descriptions of a life restored. It felt too good to be true, but the desperation gnawing at Maria Fernanda's soul outweighed her skepticism. The next morning, she dialed the number listed on the ad. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, and eerily pleasant. "Thank you for calling the Renewal Institute. We understand you're interested in reclaiming your youth." "Yes," Maria Fernanda replied, trying to mask the eagerness in her voice. "How does this work?" "Your timing is perfect," the voice continued. "We have one slot available for our most advanced procedure. It's painless, completely free, and guarantees results beyond anything you've ever imagined." Free. It echoed in her mind. It made no sense, but she didn't care. Details about risks or side effects didn't matter. "Where do I sign up?" After giving her address, the caller told her a driver would pick her up the next morning. The conversation ended abruptly, leaving her clutching the phone with a mixture of excitement and dread. When the sleek black car arrived at her doorstep, she was greeted by two smiling attendants dressed in crisp white uniforms. Their faces were unnervingly flawless, their skin smooth like porcelain. "Mrs. Maria Fernanda, welcome. Please come with us." The facility was stark and sterile, its walls a blinding white that seemed to stretch endlessly. Despite its coldness, Maria Fernanda was captivated by the photos lining the hallways, images of men and women, all young and radiant. "Everyone here looks perfect," she murmured. One of the attendants nodded. "And soon, you will too." In a dimly lit consultation room, a man introduced himself as Dr. Ezra. His smile was sharp, his eyes unreadable. He spoke about the Institute's groundbreaking technique, though his words were vague. Cellular restructuring, genetic revitalization, aesthetic transcendence, it was all jargon to her. "Will it hurt?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There may be some discomfort during the recovery process," Dr. Ezra replied, his tone almost apologetic. "But the results are worth it. You'll see." Maria Fernanda signed the papers without reading them. They led her to an operating room, where bright lights bore down on her. The last thing she remembered was the mask lowering over her face and the sound of Dr. Ezra whispering, "Welcome to the new you." When she woke, her head throbbed, and her face was wrapped tightly in bandages. "The healing process has begun," a nurse said, her voice soft but detached. "You must rest now." Days turned into weeks. Maria Fernanda remained confined to a private room, her meals brought to her, her face never revealed. She was plagued by searing pain that radiated from beneath the bandages, but whenever she asked for medication, the nurses would only smile and say, "Beauty is pain." Maria Fernanda's isolation was oppressive. The only sounds were the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional murmur of voices outside her door. Her hands itched to remove the bandages, to see the transformation promised to her, but each time she reached for them, the nurses appeared as if summoned by some unseen force. "Patience, Mrs. Maria Fernanda," they would say, their flawless faces betraying no emotion. The process must not be rushed. Her dreams became fractured and chaotic, filled with haunting visions of her younger self staring back at her with hollow eyes, mouthing words she couldn't understand. Sometimes, she would wake to the sensation of hands brushing her skin, though no one was there. One night, as she lay staring at the ceiling, the door creaked open. A nurse stepped in, her movements slow and deliberate. "It's time," she said. They guided her to a room unlike any other she had seen in the facility. It was grand and ornate, with walls lined with gilded mirrors and soft, ambient lighting that made the air feel almost magical. In the center of the room was a single chair facing a tall, full-length mirror draped in a crimson cloth. "Please, sit," the nurse instructed. Maria Fernanda obeyed, her hands trembling as she clutched the arms of the chair. The nurse moved behind her, gently unwrapping the bandages layer by layer. The pain was excruciating, each tug feeling as though it tore at her very soul. When the final strip fell away, the nurse stepped aside, revealing the mirror. With a theatrical flourish, she pulled the crimson cloth away. Maria Fernanda gasped. The face staring back at her was nothing short of miraculous. Her skin was smooth, her cheeks full, her lips plump. Gone were the lines, the sagging, the marks of time. She looked like she had stepped out of a photograph taken decades ago. But something was wrong. Her eyes. They were her eyes, yet not. They glistened with an unnatural sheen, like glass marbles. She leaned closer, and as she did, the reflection tilted its head in a way that didn't quite match her movement. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Dr. Ezra's voice startled her. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, flanked by attendants. His smile was wider than before, his teeth unnervingly white. "Yes," Maria Fernanda whispered, though the word felt foreign on her tongue. Before she could ask more, the attendants took her by the arms and led her through a series of hallways she didn't recognize. The walls grew darker, the air heavier, until they reached a large double door. "This is where your new life begins," one of the attendants said, pushing the doors open. Inside was a grand ballroom filled with people. They were exquisite, every one of them impossibly beautiful. Their laughter was melodic, their movements graceful. Maria Fernanda felt a surge of hope. She was one of them now. As she stepped into the room, the conversations ceased. Every eye turned to her, their gazes piercing and unnerving. A tall woman with raven-black hair approached her, extending a hand. "Welcome," she said, her voice dripping with elegance. "You're one of us now." The days that followed were surreal. The group, who called themselves the Beautiful Ones, treated Maria Fernanda like an honored guest. They shared stories of their transformations, speaking of their past lives with disdain. "We were ordinary once," one man said, his perfect face contorted in a sneer. "Weak, flawed. But now, we're divine." Maria Fernanda basked in their attention, but a part of her felt uneasy. There was a hunger in their eyes, a predatory edge to their smiles. Her unease grew when she noticed the absence of mirrors in the ballroom. When she asked about it, one of the women laughed. "Mirrors lie," she said cryptically. Meanwhile, Maria Fernanda's daughter, Lucia, was growing increasingly worried. Her mother's disappearance had left her restless, and when her calls to the facility went unanswered, she decided to investigate. Using an address she found scribbled in her mother's diary, Lucia arrived at the institute late one night. The building was dark and uninviting, its sterile facade now seeming more like a tomb. She slipped inside, her heart pounding as she navigated the endless corridors. Eventually, she found a door ajar, leading to a staircase descending into the depths of the building. The air grew colder with each step, and faint echoes of laughter reached her ears. Lucia descended the staircase cautiously, each creak of the old steps echoing ominously in the suffocating silence. The laughter grew louder, more unsettling, a strange blend of delight and malice. She reached the bottom to find a long corridor dimly lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Shadows danced on the walls as though alive, elongating and twisting unnaturally. Her resolve wavered, but the thought of her mother pushed her forward. She pressed herself against the cold concrete walls, edging closer to the source of the sound. At the end of the corridor, a pair of ornate wooden doors loomed. The intricate carvings on the wood depicted scenes of beauty, youth, and perfection, but upon closer inspection, Lucia noticed darker details. Distorted faces, hands clawing for help, and eyes filled with despair hidden among the artistry. She pushed the doors open just enough to peer through the gap, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The grand hall beyond was like something out of a twisted fairy tale. It was lavishly decorated, with chandeliers dripping in crystals, golden trim on every surface, and silken drapes that shimmered like liquid. But it wasn't the room's opulence that froze her, it was the gathering. Hundreds of people, all impossibly beautiful, mingled and laughed. Their perfection was almost grotesque, their features exaggerated to the point of uncanny. In the center of the room was a raised platform, and on it stood Maria Fernanda. Her mother's face was radiant, a picture of youth and allure, yet her posture was stiff, her movements jerky and unnatural. Lucia's breath caught in her throat as she realized Maria Fernanda's eyes were wide with fear, darting around the room as though searching for an escape. A man stepped onto the platform, his presence commanding. "Dr. Ezra." "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and charismatic, "we gather tonight to celebrate the purity of beauty, the sanctity of perfection. And as you all know, such perfection comes with a price." The crowd murmured their agreement, their smiles widening in a way that made Lucia's stomach churn. Dr. Ezra turned to Maria Fernanda, his gaze piercing. "Our newest member has been graced with our gift, transformed from the mundane into the extraordinary. But she must prove her worth, as we all have." He gestured, and two attendants appeared, dragging a large mirror onto the stage. Its frame was ornate, gilded in gold, and its surface shimmered unnaturally, as though the glass itself was alive. "Look into the mirror," Dr. Ezra commanded. Maria Fernanda hesitated, but the crowd's anticipatory silence left her no choice. She stepped forward, her movements wooden, and gazed into the glass. A horrific scream tore from her throat. The reflection staring back at her was not the youthful face she had seen before, but a grotesque, distorted version of herself. Her skin was cracked and peeling, her features warped, and her eyes hollow. The crowd erupted into laughter, their perfect faces alight with sadistic glee. Lucia's heart raced as she watched her mother collapse to her knees, her screams turning into desperate sobs. Dr. Ezra clapped his hands, silencing the crowd. "It seems our dear Maria Fernanda lacks the essence of true beauty," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "And there is only one fate for those who fall short." The crowd surged forward, their movements eerily synchronized. They encircled the platform, their expressions hungry. Lucia realized with dawning horror that they were holding long, thin weapons, spears, knives, and other bladed instruments, all polished to a gleaming perfection. Maria Fernanda tried to crawl away, but the crowd closed in, their laughter growing louder, more maniacal. "No!" Lucia burst into the room, her voice cracking with desperation. The room fell silent as every head turned to her. For a moment, Lucia felt like prey caught in the gaze of a predator. Dr. Ezra's smile widened, his eyes glinting with a predatory satisfaction. "And who do we have here?" he asked, descending the platform with a calculated grace. "She's my mother," Lucia said, her voice trembling but determined. "Let her go." Dr. Ezra tilted his head, regarding her with interest. "Ah, family. A bond as old as time. But tell me, child, Do you share her imperfections? The crowd murmured in amusement, their laughter soft but cutting. Lucia clenched her fists. You're monsters. All of you. Dr. Ezra's smile didn't falter. Beauty is not monstrous, my dear. It is salvation. And you have potential. Before she could react, two attendants grabbed her arms, dragging her toward the platform. Lucia struggled against the attendants' iron grip, her cries of protest echoing off the grand hall's walls. She was hauled up onto the platform and forced to her knees beside her mother, who was now too weak to do anything but gasp for breath. The crowd's laughter turned into a rhythmic chant, a wordless hum that resonated with a sinister energy. Dr. Ezra knelt before Lucia, tilting her chin upward with a hand that was unnervingly cold. His perfect smile bore down on her, a mask of false benevolence. You see, he said, his voice dripping with mock compassion, beauty is not merely skin deep. It is a force, a power that defines us. Those who cannot embody it, well, they serve another purpose. He turned to the crowd, addressing them like a preacher before his congregation. Let this be a night of transformation. The imperfect shall nourish the beautiful, and the cycle will continue. The crowd roared in approval, raising their gleaming weapons in unison. Lucia's mind raced, adrenaline surging through her veins. She glanced at her mother, who was whispering something incoherent, her lips barely moving. The sight of Maria Fernandez' hollowed eyes and trembling body filled Lucia with a desperation she had never felt before. Let her go! Lucia shouted, her voice breaking. Take me instead. Dr. Ezra raised an eyebrow, intrigued. The crowd murmured, their interest piqued. Such bravery, he mused, his tone patronizing. But beauty cannot be inherited or transferred, my dear. It must be earned, or proven. He snapped his fingers, and the attendants released Lucia. She fell to the ground, scrambling to her feet as the crowd parted, revealing a grotesque new spectacle. A massive, ornate cage was wheeled into the room. Inside it, bound and gagged, were others like Maria Fernanda, disheveled, frightened, and trembling. Their faces bore the same youthful glow, but their expressions betrayed the torment beneath. This is your test, Dr. Ezra declared, gesturing toward the cage. Show us your loyalty to beauty. Prove you are one of us by ridding the world of these impurities. Lucia's stomach churned as she realized what he meant. A set of polished knives was presented to her on a velvet tray. The crowd watched in silence, their perfect faces alight with eager anticipation. No, she whispered, shaking her head. I won't do it. Dr. Ezra's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold disdain. Then you and your mother will share their fate. Before she could react, two attendants dragged Maria Fernanda forward, forcing her to her knees before the mirror. Her mother's sobs broke Lucia's resolve. She couldn't let this happen. Wait, she cried, her voice cracking. I'll do it. Just don't hurt her. The crowd erupted in cheers, their grotesque delight making Lucia's skin crawl. She was handed one of the knives, its blade unnervingly sharp. The metallic scent of the cage filled her nostrils as she approached it, her hands trembling. Inside, the captives pleaded through their gags, their eyes wide with terror. Lucia's vision blurred as tears filled her eyes. She could hear her mother behind her, weakly calling her name. She raised the knife, her grip tightening as she tried to steel herself. But her heart rebelled against the act. These were people, not objects to be sacrificed for some sick ideology. As the blade hovered above the first captive, something shifted in the room. The air grew heavy, and the once controlled chanting of the crowd turned into an impatient, hungry growl. Dr. Ezra stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. You hesitate, he said, his voice cold. Perhaps you are no different than your mother after all. He turned to the attendants. Dispose of them both. The attendants advanced on Maria Fernanda, their weapons gleaming in the dim light. Lucia's heart pounded as she realized the choice before her. Submit to the ritual or fight back. Her grip on the knife tightened. No, she whispered, then louder, no. She spun around, slashing wildly at the attendants. The first fell back, clutching his arm, but the other was quicker, grabbing her wrist and twisting the knife from her hand. The crowd surged forward, their perfect faces contorted with anger. Dr. Ezra's voice rose above the chaos, commanding order, but the frenzy was unstoppable. The room erupted into chaos. Lucia's screams were drowned out by the roars of the crowd as they descended upon her. Her mother, too weak to move, was left defenseless on the floor. Lucia fought with every ounce of strength she had, but the perfectly sculpted hands of the crowd clawed at her, their nails like blades, cutting into her skin. "Stop! Stop!" Lucia yelled, her voice raw, but the crowd was beyond reason. Amid the turmoil, Maria Fernanda stirred, her voice a frail echo that barely rose above the din. "Lucia," she whispered, her trembling hand reaching out. Lucia saw her mother and felt a surge of adrenaline. She wrenched herself free from one of her captors, snatching the knife from the ground. Without thinking, she lunged at the closest attacker, the blade sinking deep into their chest. A silence fell over the room as the crowd stepped back, stunned. The man she stabbed staggered, clutching the knife, his perfect face twisted in shock. But as he fell, something horrifying happened. His beauty began to dissolve. His flawless features melted away, revealing sagging, decayed flesh underneath. Lucia stumbled backward, horrified. "They're not human," she whispered. Dr. Ezra's booming voice cut through the momentary stillness. "What a waste," he said, his tone icy. "You could have joined us, Lucia. But instead, you've chosen death." He gestured sharply, and the crowd surged forward again, their once perfect faces now showing glimpses of the monstrous forms beneath. Lucia grabbed her mother, pulling her to her feet. "Get up, Mom. We have to go." Maria Fernanda groaned in pain but managed to stand with her daughter's help. Together, they stumbled toward the massive doors at the far end of the room, the crowd closing in behind them. They reached the doors and threw them open, only to find themselves on the edge of a cliff. Below them stretched a churning sea of darkness, its waves glowing faintly with an eerie green light. "There's nowhere to run," Dr. Ezra said, stepping into the doorway behind them. His once perfect smile now revealed sharp, jagged teeth, and his eyes gleamed with an otherworldly hunger. Lucia held the knife out in front of her, shielding her mother as best she could. "Stay back," she shouted, though her voice trembled. Dr. Ezra laughed, a sound that echoed like breaking glass. "You can't protect her. She belongs to us now." Lucia's mind raced. She couldn't fight them all, and there was nowhere to go. She turned to her mother, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Before Maria Fernanda could respond, Lucia stepped forward, knife raised. But instead of attacking Ezra, she drove the blade into the wooden lever beside the door, causing the platform beneath them to shudder. "What are you doing?" Ezra roared, lunging toward her. Lucia pulled her mother close as the platform gave way, sending them both tumbling into the abyss below. They hit the water hard, the icy chill knocking the air from their lungs. Lucia struggled to stay afloat, pulling her mother up as waves of green light surged around them. Above, the cliff edge was crowded with figures, their monstrous forms illuminated by the strange glow. "They are coming!" Maria Fernanda gasped, clinging to her daughter. Lucia looked around desperately, her eyes catching on a faint light in the distance. It was a small boat, its lantern swaying in the waves. "Over there," she shouted, dragging her mother toward it. As they swam, the water seemed to pull at them, as though it were alive. Lucia kicked harder, her muscles burning, but the boat stayed tantalizingly out of reach. Behind them, the crowd began descending the cliffs, their bodies unnaturally fast and agile. Just as Lucia thought they wouldn't make it, a hand reached out from the boat, pulling her and her mother aboard. She looked up to see a man with weathered features and tired eyes. "You're lucky I saw you," he said, his voice rough. "Not many escape the club of the beautiful." The boat pushed off, the monstrous figures on the cliffs screaming in frustration. Lucia collapsed beside her mother, tears of relief streaming down her face. But as the boat sailed into the darkness, the man turned to her with a grim expression. "They'll never stop hunting you," he said. "Not as long as they think you don't belong." Lucia stared at him, her exhaustion giving way to a cold dread. "Then we'll make sure they can't find us," she whispered. The old man nodded grimly, his weathered hands tightening on the oars. The boat cut through the dark, glowing waves like a phantom, each stroke carrying them further from the cliff. Maria Fernanda coughed weakly, her frail body trembling from cold and exhaustion. Lucia wrapped her arms around her mother, trying to warm her. "We're safe now, Mom," she whispered, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The man's lantern cast flickering shadows across his face, making his expression unreadable. "Safe? There's no safe place from them, girl," he muttered. "They have eyes everywhere. Their influence stretches beyond what you can imagine." Lucia clenched her jaw. "Then we'll fight them. We'll stop them." The man laughed bitterly. "You think you're the first to try? I've seen their victims, heard their promises. Their beauty hides the rot inside, and their lies draw in the desperate. You'd be better off hiding and praying they forget you." The boat docked at a small, dilapidated pier that jutted out from the rocky shore of an unmarked island. The man gestured for them to follow him. "Come on. I'll show you where you can rest. But remember, if they find you, it's over." Lucia helped her mother to her feet, supporting her as they walked. The island was eerily silent, its dense forest shrouded in mist. Every rustle of leaves and distant creak of branches set Lucia on edge. The man led them to a small, weather-beaten cabin nestled among the trees. Inside, it was sparse but dry, with a small fire crackling in the hearth. "You'll be safe here for now," he said, placing a battered kettle over the fire. "But don't get comfortable." That night, Lucia sat by her mother's bedside, watching her shallow breathing. Maria Fernanda's face was pale, her features sunken. The glow of youth and beauty she had longed for was gone, replaced by the ravages of pain and despair. "Why did you do it, Mom?" Lucia whispered, her voice breaking. "Why did you believe them?" Maria Fernanda's eyes fluttered open, glistening with tears. "I wanted to be someone you could be proud of," she murmured. "Someone who could protect you." Lucia's heart twisted with guilt. She took her mother's hand, holding it tightly. "You've always been enough for me, Mom. Always." The next morning, Lucia woke to the sound of distant voices. She bolted upright, her heart pounding. Peeking out the window, she saw figures moving through the trees. "They've found us," the old man hissed, grabbing a rusty shotgun from the wall. Lucia shook her mother awake. "Mom, we have to go." Maria Fernanda groaned, her movements sluggish. "I can't. I'm too weak." Lucia looked at her in despair, then turned to the man. "We need more time. Can you hold them off?" He gave her a grim nod. "I'll do what I can. But if they catch me, you run. Don't look back." Lucia helped her mother out of bed, half carrying her as they slipped out the back door. The forest seemed alive with whispers, the shadows shifting unnaturally. Every step felt like a gamble, the air thick with tension. As they stumbled through the undergrowth, the distant sound of gunfire echoed behind them. "We can't keep running," Maria Fernanda gasped, collapsing to her knees. "Leave me, Lucia. Save yourself." "No," Lucia said fiercely, pulling her mother to her feet. "I'm not leaving you. Not now, not ever." But as they pressed on, the forest opened into a clearing. Waiting for them, illuminated by the eerie glow of the moon, was Dr. Ezra and his congregation of the beautiful. "How touching," Dr. Ezra said, his smile razor-sharp. "A daughter's love for her mother. But love won't save you." The crowd surrounded them, their faces unnervingly flawless. They carried long, silver blades that glinted in the moonlight, their steps synchronized like a predator circling its prey. Lucia pushed her mother behind her, gripping a jagged branch she had picked up along the way. "You can't have her," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Dr. Ezra laughed, the sound cold and hollow. "Oh, my dear, she was never ours to take. She gave herself to us willingly. And you've merely delayed the inevitable." As the beautiful closed in, Lucia raised the branch, ready to fight. But then, to her horror, Maria Fernanda stepped forward, her body trembling but her eyes eerily calm. "Mom, no!" Lucia cried, reaching for her. Maria Fernanda turned to her daughter, a sad smile on her lips. "I won't let them take you, Lucia. I'll end this." Before Lucia could stop her, Maria Fernanda lunged at Dr. Ezra, the last remnants of her strength channeled into one final act of defiance. The silver blade in his hand caught the moonlight as he stepped back, avoiding her charge. But Maria Fernanda's movement had given Lucia the opportunity she needed. "No!" Lucia screamed, grabbing her mother's arm and pulling her back just as Dr. Ezra's blade swiped through the air where Maria Fernanda had been moments before. The crowd's serene faces faltered for the briefest moment, their perfected masks cracking as hunger and fury flashed behind their eyes. Dr. Ezra snarled, his calm composure shattered. "Enough of this," he roared, raising his arms to signal the crowd forward. The beautiful surged, their synchronized march like a tide ready to drown them. Lucia's pulse thundered in her ears. She had to think fast, searching desperately for anything she could use. Her eyes caught a sharp, broken branch lying on the ground nearby. Without hesitation, she lunged for it and swung it with all her strength, knocking the silver blade from the nearest attacker's hands. "Run, Mom!" she shouted, as the crowd surged forward, claws and blades glinting in the pale light. Maria Fernanda's eyes met her daughter's, filled with pride and sadness. "Be brave," she whispered before falling to her knees, her body spent and broken. Lucia hesitated, the choice gnawing at her heart. But there was no time. The crowd reached them, hands grasping, fingers clawing. Lucia ducked, spinning past a masked attacker and plunging into the woods, her feet pounding the soft earth as she pushed forward. The forest's undergrowth tore at her clothing, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. A sudden, harsh shout pierced the chaos. "Leave her!" Dr. Ezra's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. The crowd paused, their heads swiveling to face their leader. Lucia glanced back to see Dr. Ezra standing in the clearing, watching her with eyes like cold, ancient stars. "You're not worthy of her sacrifice," he said, voice dripping with disdain. His gaze locked onto Lucia one final time, as if memorizing her. And then, they scattered, leaving behind the dark woods and the fading glow of the moon. Lucia stumbled into the clearing, gasping for air. The silence of the forest seemed impossibly loud after the tumult. She turned to see Maria Fernanda, still on her knees, surrounded by the faint, pale light of dawn breaking through the canopy. Tears streamed down Lucia's face as she knelt beside her mother. Maria Fernanda looked up, eyes soft but fading, and reached out to touch Lucia's cheek. "You're my hope, Michigan Amor," she said, voice weakening. "Promise me, you'll keep fighting, even when it's hard." Lucia nodded, the weight of her mother's sacrifice settling deep in her chest. "I promise." Maria Fernanda's fingers fell limp, her eyes still wide but now dull. The forest around them seemed to mourn, the wind whistling with a shudder of grief. Lucia sat there for a long moment, the weight of loss pressing down on her, before standing and wiping her tears away. The battle was far from over, but now she was ready, and somewhere deep inside her, a spark had reignited, one that would not be extinguished by beauty, fear, or the cold, unrelenting shadows of the beautiful. With one last look at her mother's lifeless form, Lucia turned and began to move, every step a promise made, every heartbeat a vow. The fight had only just begun.
I sat in the sterile waiting room, the ticking of the clock drumming into my ears, each second stretching longer than the last. Dr. Mounds's words replayed in my mind, a cruel echo. "The results show that pregnancy is unlikely," he had said, his eyes soft with sympathy. Matt had squeezed my hand, the only reassurance I felt at the moment. "We'll keep trying," he said, his voice tight but determined. As we left the clinic, Matt murmured, "We'll get through this, I promise." But his promise felt hollow against the sharp, unrelenting ache in my chest. We were silent in the car, the heavy quiet broken only by the rain lashing against the windshield. It was late, and the city lights blurred into a melancholy glow. The receptionist, Bernadette, caught my eye as we passed the front desk, She waved, a small, knowing smile on her lips. "You'll be okay," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "I've seen you here for a while, Liv. I have something that might help." I blinked, taken aback. "What is it?" She reached into a drawer, pulling out a carved wooden totem, its surface etched with symbols I didn't recognize. "This has been in my family for generations. It's a fertility charm. Place it under your bed, and you'll see. Trust me, I wouldn't give it to you if I didn't believe it would help." I hesitated, but the desperate ache inside me pushed me to accept it. "Thank you," I whispered. It was absurd, but for a fleeting moment, hope sparked in the dark corners of my mind. That night, I placed the totem under our bed, fingers trembling. Matt had fallen asleep quickly, exhaustion seeping into his bones. The storm outside raged, thunder rolling across the sky like the growl of an unseen beast. I lay there, eyes wide open, listening to the wind batter the house, trying to ignore the shiver that crept over my skin. 16 months later, the house felt different, heavy. Aaron's cries pierced the silence of the night. I reached out, trying to comfort him, but his cries only grew louder, more insistent. My heart pounded as I glanced at the monitor, then at Norma, our nanny, who stood in the doorway, the baby cradled in her arms. She murmured something soothing, and miraculously, Aaron quieted. "You're doing great, Liv," she said, but her eyes told a different story. I turned, biting back the frustration that had welled up inside me. "I don't know how to make him happy," I whispered. "It's like he doesn't even want me." That night, after the storm had passed, I sat in the nursery, the monitor clutched in my hand. The screen flickered and static filled the silence. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced around, heart thundering. When I looked under the bed, the totem lay overturned, its symbols twisted and darkened. I picked it up, fingers shaking. "Thanks for nothing," I whispered, and shoved it into a box in the closet. A sound startled me. Footsteps. The door creaked and I spun around, breath caught in my throat. Matt stood there, his face obscured by a grotesque mask. "They told me to wear it," he said, voice muffled and hollow. "I have to be back at the set in 2 hours." I let out a ragged breath, relief mingling with the raw, tangled emotions. He removed the mask, eyes softening when he saw me. "Liv, I know this is hard," he said, "but you're not alone. I don't want you to go through this without me." The next day, I sat across from Dr. Berger, her office bright and cold. "It's just postpartum stress," she said, dismissing my claims as if they were nothing more than fleeting thoughts. "It's normal for mothers to feel disconnected. Your baby can't hate you." "Then why?" I whispered, the memory of Aaron's screams sharp in my mind. "Why does it feel like he does?" That night, the baby monitor crackled to life. A shadow loomed over Aaron's crib, dark and inhuman. My breath caught as I rushed into the room, heart pounding. The closet door was ajar, a low growl echoing from within. When I looked inside, nothing moved, but the tablet in my hand displayed the figure of a man, cloaked in shadows. The next morning I sat with Matt, the tablet between us. The recording played, the voice so clear it made my blood freeze. "I want him." I shivered, my hands trembling as I pressed the stop button. Matt frowned. "You're hearing things," he said, eyes narrowing. "Maybe you need more rest." But the feeling of something lurking in the dark, waiting, refused to leave me. I had to do something. That night I ventured to the fertility clinic. Bernadette listened, eyes wide with a mixture of concern and guilt. "It's not a demon," she said, her voice trembling. "Baal is not what you think, but I can help you." She led me to her apartment, hands shaking as she pulled out an old grimoire. The spell was simple, but it required blood, my blood. "To banish him, you must show your intent," Bernadette whispered. That night, I stood in the darkened nursery, the dagger in my hand as I whispered the incantation. The air grew colder, shadows coalescing around me. A sharp scream split the silence as Matt stumbled into the room, eyes wide with horror. I didn't see him, only the blade sinking into the chest of the figure before me. 2 weeks later, I sat in the sanitarium staring out at the sun-dappled courtyard. Matt came, eyes filled with regret. "You didn't mean to," he said, voice breaking. "And Aaron, he's safe." I nodded, but the peace I sought felt like a distant dream. I wasn't leaving until I knew I could protect him. But Matt's face was pale, eyes darting to the shadows. "Bernadette's gone," he whispered. "And the others. Baal, he didn't leave." A growl echoed from the hallway, and the lights flickered. I stood, looking out the window at the dark sky. My hand found Aaron's small one. "It's just you and me," I whispered. "Always." And behind me, the dark figure watched, waiting.
The following story is one of suspense and dread, a tale that drifts between the realm of the living and the whispers of the past. It may not be suited for the faint of heart. I woke up in the middle of the night, the silence suffocating. It felt like the walls of the room were pressing in, whispering secrets I could never understand. The clock on the bedside table read 3:17, a time that always seemed significant, as though the numbers themselves held a message I couldn't grasp. I sat up, shoving the blankets away as an icy draft snaked around my ankles. The window was closed, yet the chill in the room told a different story. The house had always been old, its creaks and groans a familiar symphony. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, the creaks were deliberate. A rhythmic thud echoed from the hallway, followed by what sounded like dragging. I froze, straining my ears, searching for any rational explanation. Was it the wind? The old house settling? Or something else? My heart drummed in my chest as I slid out of bed. I tiptoed to the door, wincing at every creak of the wooden floorboards. I glanced back at the bed, as if it might offer some protection, but it sat empty, a silent witness to my growing fear. The hallway stretched out in front of me, its end lost in the shadows. A faint light flickered at the far end, an old lamp left on in the living room. The dragging sound came again, closer this time. A chill swept over me, not just from the cold but from the sensation of being watched. I swallowed hard and stepped out, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I passed the closed bathroom door and couldn't help but imagine what might be lurking inside. I dared not open it. I reached the living room and found nothing amiss, the lamp sputtering as if the wick were about to die. The drapes were half closed, letting in slivers of moonlight that painted eerie patterns on the walls. I pressed my hand to the window, expecting it to be cold, but it was warm, unnaturally so. My pulse quickened. A loud bang resonated from behind me, and I spun around just in time to see the shadow move. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that bent at odd angles, like a marionette controlled by a puppeteer with a cruel sense of humor. It took a step forward, and I saw its eyes, two black voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall. The figure tilted its head, as if examining me, then reached out with a hand that ended in long, gnarled fingers. A voice, deep and guttural, rasped from somewhere within its chest. "Help me." I wanted to run, but my legs felt leaden, my mind screaming at me to move, to escape, to wake up from whatever nightmare I had fallen into. But the figure was real. I could see it, feel its presence, like the room had been hijacked by something that didn't belong. Who are you?" My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, and as it came into the moonlight, I realized that it wasn't just one being. It was the fusion of many, stitched together by a dark, malevolent force. The face that stared back at me was familiar, a contorted mask of someone I once knew, someone who had disappeared years ago, presumed dead. "Help me," it repeated, this time louder, more insistent. "Find her." I took a sharp breath as my body finally obeyed, bolting for the front door. I could hear its limbs creaking and cracking as it pursued me, the sound sending waves of nausea through my stomach. The doorknob was cold to the touch, and I fumbled to twist it, my fingers slick with sweat. The creature's breath, hot and putrid, hit the back of my neck just as the door swung open. I didn't dare look back as I stepped out into the night. The wind howled, carrying with it a chorus of whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. My feet pounded the pavement as I ran, heart racing, the memory of those dark eyes seared into my mind. It was only when I reached the edge of the woods, the trees looming like dark sentinels, that I stopped, gasping for air. I turned back, half expecting to see that figure emerging from the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the rustling of leaves and the haunting echo of my own breath. But then, a voice, familiar yet twisted, spoke behind me. "You shouldn't have left." I spun around, eyes wide, but the woods were empty. Or so I thought. The wind picked up, howling like a pack of wolves. My heart pounded against my ribcage as I strained my eyes to pierce the gloom. The woods were alive, and the shadows danced as though they had a life of their own. I took a shaky step back, the ground beneath my feet uneven and slick with dew. "You shouldn't have left," the voice repeated, this time closer, as if it were at my ear. A shiver rippled down my spine, but I forced myself to turn around. The figure was there, standing between the trees, its shape more defined now. Its limbs moved with unnatural fluidity, each joint bending in ways that no human could mimic. Its face was still that of someone I knew, the eyes wide and hollow, mouth contorted in a silent scream. I wanted to scream, to run, but my voice caught in my throat. The creature stepped forward, and I saw now that its entire body was a patchwork of shadows and flesh, limbs stitched together by jagged scars that glistened in the pale moonlight. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, my legs trembling as I backed up against the rough bark of a tree. "Why?" I whispered, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. "Why are you here?" It tilted its head, its eyes focusing on me with a painful intensity. "To take you home." Before I could react, it lunged, reaching out with fingers that seemed to stretch impossibly long, grasping at the air. I dodged to the side, narrowly avoiding the sharp claws that raked through the space where I had been. The force sent me sprawling onto the damp earth. I scrambled backward, my hands clawing at the ground, looking for something, anything to defend myself. The creature's breath was loud, wet, as it loomed over me. Its voice came again, softer, almost pleading. "Help me, find her. You have to." I stared up at it, my vision swimming with terror. I could feel the moisture of the soil seeping into my clothes, the cold biting into my skin. There was something familiar in the voice, a memory I couldn't place. "Who?" I croaked, the question escaping as little more than a breath. Its face shifted, morphing into that of a woman I had not thought about in years. A woman who had vanished without a trace. The memory hit me with the force of a punch to the gut. Laura, my best friend, lost after the accident that no one wanted to speak of. Her voice broke through my panic, calling my name, pleading with me. "Laura," I whispered. The creature nodded, its expression filled with a dark, desperate hope. A sudden crack of thunder split the sky, and the world seemed to tilt. The forest seemed to close in, the trees creaking and groaning as though they were alive. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes locked on the figure that had once been Laura, now a twisted mockery of life. "Laura, what happened to you?" I demanded, but the answer came as a guttural growl that resonated in my bones. It lunged again, and this time I was ready. I ducked beneath its outstretched arms, stumbling backward until I found myself against the base of an old oak tree, its roots like bony fingers clutching at the earth. I was trapped. The creature stepped closer, its eyes bright with a mix of recognition and something far darker. It reached out, and for a moment, I thought it might touch me, might pull me into the darkness that waited behind those hollow eyes. "You have to come with me," it whispered again. "To find her." And then, before I could react, I felt the ground shift beneath me, a rumble that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The roots of the tree cracked and splintered, splitting open like the jaws of a giant beast. I fell backward, hands scrabbling for purchase, but the hole in the ground was relentless, a moor of shadow and noise. The creature's face contorted with an emotion I couldn't name as it reached for me one last time. Its hand caught my wrist, and a searing cold shot through my body, spreading like wildfire. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the void. I fell, the last thing I saw being the creature's eyes, the faint trace of a tear that glistened as it slid down its cheek, and a voice that whispered, "Help me." And then darkness. The sound of rustling leaves and the creak of wood became a sinister melody, an echo that swept through Margot's old, dilapidated house. The storm outside still raged, pounding the windows with gusts of wind and rain as if nature itself were trying to warn her of the danger lurking in the shadows. She sat up on the bed, her heart pounding in her chest as lightning illuminated the room with brief, jagged bursts. The grandfather clock, an ancient contraption of wood and brass that had belonged to her grandfather, marked midnight with an irregular ticking, as if it had a life of its own. Margot knew the house was alive, that its walls had witnessed things no human could bear. When she had moved in 2 months ago, the neighbors had told her stories of disappearances, whispers in the night, and figures with dark eyes that slipped through the hallways. At first, she thought they were just tales meant to scare newcomers, but that night, with the wind hissing and the house creaking as if it were breathing, she realized those stories might be more true than she wanted to believe. The bedroom door slammed shut, and the sound reverberated like a sinister heartbeat through the halls. Margot got out of bed, trembling, and moved toward the door. An icy chill swept across her skin as she noticed that the lock was intact, but somehow, the door had closed on its own. The doorknob, made of black metal, felt like ice beneath her fingers. There was no reason for the door to close. It wasn't in the right place. It was impossible. Margot, the voice, deep and resonant, came from the hallway, but she didn't recognize it. It wasn't her mother's voice, nor her father's, nor anyone she knew. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Her breath quickened as she strained to listen, trying to place it, but there was only silence after. A flash of lightning lit up the hallway, revealing a fleeting silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking as she reached for the light switch. But the bulb didn't flicker on, leaving her alone in a pool of cold, flickering shadows. Margot took a step forward, but her feet seemed to sink into the wooden floor as if it had turned to tar. The whisper came again, this time closer, so close she could feel its breath on her neck. "You shouldn't have come back." The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move, coiling around her like dark tendrils. Margot forced herself to move, to pull her feet out of the floor and break through the dark. The room spun around her, and the ticking of the grandfather clock became a deafening roar in her ears. She reached for the door again, but before she could touch it, the handle twisted, and it swung open on its own. In the hallway stood a figure cloaked in tattered black, with hollow eyes that seemed to stretch into infinity. Its voice, cold and cruel, whispered through the silence. "You've awakened it." Margot tried to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. Her mind raced, remembering the stories of the house, of the figure that never left, of the thing that had been waiting for her to return. The storm outside became a cacophony, blending with the low, guttural growl that echoed through the walls. And then it whispered again, in that same deep, resonant voice. "Now, it begins." The figure stepped forward, and with each movement, the shadows in the hallway seemed to thicken, weaving around its form like a living shroud. Margot stumbled backward, her hands clammy and trembling as she tried to find her voice. The storm outside roared louder, its violent crescendo muffling everything else. The floorboards beneath her creaked and groaned, as if protesting her presence, urging her to flee. But she couldn't move. The figure tilted its head, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a gaze that made her feel as if her very soul was being pierced. It raised one long, skeletal hand, its fingers warped and claw-like, and pointed at her with a slow, deliberate motion. "Margot," it whispered, the sound slicing through the din of the storm like a blade. "It's time." The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that she could see her breath clouding in front of her. The walls of the hallway seemed to shrink, pressing in on her with an unseen force. She could feel the weight of centuries, of stories told in hushed, fearful tones, pushing down on her as the figure inched closer. With a sudden, desperate burst of courage, Margot lunged forward, scrambling past the figure with her hands outstretched, searching for the door. She didn't know where she was running to, only that she needed to get out. The figure made no sound as she passed, but she felt its presence seeping into her bones, wrapping around her like chains. The hallway was a blur, dark corners and twisted reflections flashing by. Margot's heart pounded like a war drum in her chest, and her legs threatened to collapse beneath her. She reached the staircase, her fingers scrabbling at the worn wood, and leapt down the steps 2 at a time, the wooden banister splintering under her frantic touch. Outside, the wind screamed, rattling the shutters and whipping the rain against the glass like a frenzied, unseen hand. Margot pushed through the front door, stumbling out into the storm. The night was alive with the sound of the wind, the pounding rain, and something else, something deeper, a low hum that resonated from within the earth itself. She felt a sudden, unexplainable pull, as if the house was calling her back. A voice whispered in her ear, sweet and full of promise. "Margot, come back." No, no, she thought. She couldn't go back. Not now, not ever. But the ground beneath her feet trembled, and with an unnatural force, the house seemed to breathe, shifting and groaning as if it were awakening from a long slumber. The dark figure appeared in the doorway, its silhouette framed by flickering candlelight from within. Its hollow eyes met hers one last time, and for a moment, Margot swore she saw something that resembled a smile. A memory flashed in her mind, a memory of her grandfather's voice, low and gravelly, warning her of the house's curse. "It never leaves," he had said. "It waits. And when it calls, you must never answer." The storm raged around her, the wind tearing at her clothes and hair. But she could see the light, the soft glow of the village in the distance, the warmth of safety that beckoned her forward. She turned, ready to flee, when the whispering started. It came from all around her, soft and insistent. "You cannot escape." She felt the shadow creeping up behind her, curling around her like an oily fog. It whispered her name, and the sound clawed at her sanity. She fell to her knees, her mind spiraling into terror as she heard footsteps approaching from within the house. Heavy, measured steps that were not her own. "Margot," the voice said once more. It was no longer a whisper but a deep, resonant call that filled her ears and made her body quiver. And then, as if the storm itself had breathed life into it, the figure emerged from the shadows. The corners of the world blurred as she reached out to the distant lights of the village, but they were too far, slipping away as the dark consumed everything. The last thing Margot saw was the wide, empty stare of those hollow eyes, and then darkness. Margot awoke in a place that defied explanation. The air was thick, heavy with a damp, earthbound scent that clung to her like a shroud. There were no walls, no ceiling, only an expanse of inky black, shifting and pulsating around her. The sound of her own heartbeat thudded in her ears, a rhythmic drumbeat that seemed to echo from the depths of the void. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice trembling as it bounced back to her, a cruel mockery. The ground beneath her feet was cold, rough, almost like stone, but it quaked with each heartbeat, as if it were alive. A shiver ran through her as she tried to stand, her body protesting, her limbs weak and uncooperative. She stumbled, fingers scrabbling for purchase on the uneven surface. And then she heard it, an echo, familiar but warped, as if carried on a breath from somewhere far away. "Margot!" She froze, eyes wide, searching the dark. The whisper was coming from somewhere close, a deep, guttural sound that felt as if it had been pulled from the earth itself. Fear pooled in her stomach, cold and sharp. She backed away, tripping over the uneven ground, landing hard with a breath-stealing thud. "Why did you come back?" The voice continued, now unmistakably human, but twisted, its edges frayed with malice. Margot's vision blurred with the sharp sting of tears, but she blinked them away. She pushed herself up, her hands scraping across the rough surface, leaving bloody imprints behind. There, standing before her, was the figure from the house. Its eyes, dark and endless, were now rimmed with an eerie, greenish glow, like the light of a forgotten grave. "It was never meant for you," the figure said, taking a step forward. Each footfall echoed in the nothingness, deep and resonant. Its shape wavered, like a mirage, before solidifying into something more real, more tangible. Margot's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse quickened as memories flooded back, The warnings her grandfather had given her, the stories of the house, the endless nights of whispers and flickering shadows. Her mind spun with thoughts of escape, but the realization sank in like a stone. There was no escape. What are you? She demanded, her voice stronger now, though it trembled with uncertainty. The figure tilted its head again, the eerie smile deepening on its cracked, hollow face. We are the keepers, it said, each word dripping with a weight that made Margot's bones ache. The guardians of what was promised. The price of curiosity, of trespassing where none should. Margot's vision flickered, and she saw, for just a heartbeat, a scene play out in the darkness. A room, a candle flickering, and a hand, her own, trembling and reaching for an old, worn key. The memory of that night replayed like a cruel twist of fate, and she gasped, clenching her fists against her temples. The key. No, she whispered. I didn't. I couldn't have known. But you did, the figure said, the sound of it like gravel being crushed underfoot. It reached out a long, bony hand and touched her cheek, the chill of its fingers seeping into her skin. Now you must pay. Suddenly, the ground quaked with more force, and Margot stumbled backward, collapsing to her knees. The blackness around her shifted, giving way to whispers that came from all sides, a chorus of voices that spoke in a language older than time. The figure stepped closer, its eyes burning with a light that seared the darkness. Margot's vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she saw her own reflection within those eyes, screaming, terrified, pleading. And then she felt it. The first touch of ice-cold tendrils curling around her ankles, creeping up her legs, entwining her body with a suffocating embrace. They tightened, dragging her down, pulling her into the abyss. She screamed, the sound lost amidst the cacophony of whispers and distant, mocking laughter. Help, she shouted, her voice barely audible over the storm, now howling within this dark realm. But no one answered. The tendrils tightened their grip, dragging her further into the darkness, and all she could do was close her eyes and surrender to the terrible, inevitable pull. And as the last trace of her consciousness faded, a single thought burned brightly in her mind. It was never meant for her. The echoes of her screams reverberated into the silence, swallowed by the endless dark. And then, nothing. Margot's consciousness flickered in the abyss, a lone spark on the edge of extinguishment. But then, something changed. A sound, a soft, barely perceptible hum, drew her attention. It was different from the cacophony, a melody familiar and fragile, almost like a lullaby. Her senses, dulled and fractured, sharpened for just a moment as the hum grew louder, more defined. The tendrils that had wrapped around her seemed to recoil, shuddering as if in pain. She could feel them loosening, the grip on her ankles and legs weakening, slipping like a tide retreating from the shore. Margot gasped, drawing in a ragged breath as her body was pulled up from the dark, back toward the faint glimmer of consciousness. The whispering ceased, and the laughter, so sharp and hollow before, was replaced by a sudden, stifled silence. Margot, the voice, soft and reassuring, echoed through the stillness. It was not the twisted voice from before. This voice was warm, grounding, even tender. She opened her eyes, the darkness still clinging to her like smoke. But now, there was a light, soft and gold, growing from somewhere within her. The tendrils had retreated, now only thin, lifeless cords that hung like broken vines. And there, in the light, was the figure. It was no longer a monstrous shadow, but a familiar shape, one she recognized instantly. "Grandfather," she whispered, her voice hoarse, disbelieving. The old man stood before her, his eyes kind and understanding, but filled with an unspoken sorrow. "It's time to break the promise, Margot," he said, stepping forward. His hand reached out, brushing the hair from her face with the same gentleness she remembered as a child. "But, the house," she murmured, a shiver racking her frame. "What's happening? I don't understand." He looked into her eyes, and in that moment, she saw everything, every story, every warning, every truth that had been hidden in whispers and half-remembered dreams. The house, the key, the ritual, it was all meant to guard, to bind something that should never have escaped. He had hoped to shield her from it, but the price had been exacted, one way or another. "It was never meant for you," he said again, his voice breaking. "But I should have done more to protect you." Margot felt a sudden surge of something she couldn't name, but it spread like fire through her veins, warm and fierce. The golden light around her grew, engulfing her in its embrace, and the shadows that had once threatened to swallow her were now pushed away by its brilliance. The figure began to fade, merging with the light, but there was no fear in his departure, only a smile that carried a silent promise. "Wake up, Margot," he said, his voice fading into a whisper. "It's not over yet." A surge of power erupted from her, radiating out like the burst of a star being born. The last of the tendrils were shattered, melting into wisps of smoke. The darkness quivered, then fell silent. The echoes of the whispers, the malevolent laughter, gone. She stood in the light, breathing in the cool, pure air of freedom. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the silence. Margot turned to see the house, that malevolent, ancient edifice, its windows dark and lifeless, its walls shuddering as if in pain. A terrible screech rose from its depths, a sound so raw it made her teeth ache. She knew what was coming. The promise, the curse, it had been broken, but at a cost. The house could no longer hold what had been kept within, and now it was spilling out into the world. "Go, Margot," her grandfather's voice echoed one final time, clear and urgent. "You must leave before it's too late." But Margot did not move. Her gaze fell upon the key in her hand, the one that had once promised safety but had instead led to this. The key, now glinting with an unnatural light, was pulsing as if alive. The ground beneath her feet began to quake, the light that had saved her flickering like a dying flame. She looked up, eyes locked with the darkness that spilled from the house, and a fierce resolve filled her. "I won't let it end like this," she whispered, voice steady. Margot tightened her grip on the key and took one final step forward, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that the real fight was only beginning. The ground trembled beneath Margot's feet, and the darkened sky overhead seemed to cave in on itself. Shadows stretched, crawling like serpents toward the house, now buckling and splintering under the weight of the ancient force it had contained for so long. Margot held the key tight, its edges digging into her palm, a sharp reminder of the choice she had made. A deep, resonant voice filled the air, one that was neither human nor earthly, a sound that made her blood freeze and her bones ache. It called her name, dripping with malice and the promise of unending torment. She turned to face the house, her pulse pounding like a war drum in her chest. The light she had summoned was weakening, flickering as if caught in a storm. The golden glow that had protected her before was now dimming, consumed by the dark force that crept from the crumbling walls. She could feel the weight of the old, broken promises pressing on her chest, urging her to abandon her stance and run, to give in and forget the sacrifice her grandfather had made. "No," Margot whispered, and the word became a rallying cry. The key's pulse grew stronger in her hand, and she raised it high, letting the light it held spill over her like a beacon. The voice screamed, distorted and enraged, as if struck. The shadows recoiled, reforming and coiling, desperate to return to their master's command. But it was too late. The power within the key was not just light. It was a piece of the same force that had trapped the entity in the first place. A force she had been born to wield, but never understood until now. With a final, shattering blow, Margot thrust the key toward the darkened sky. A blinding light erupted from its center, cascading through the landscape like the sun breaking through a storm. The shadows screamed as they disintegrated, consumed in a wave of radiant energy that washed over everything. The house, no longer a fortress of fear, shattered into a cloud of dust and embers, vanishing into the wind like a memory that could never return. The silence that followed was profound, a deep, resonant stillness that echoed in Margot's ears. She let out a shaky breath and looked up at the sky, now painted with the soft hues of dawn, the first light of a new day breaking the hold of the long night. The terror was over. The darkness had been banished, but not without cost. Margot's heart ached for the loss, for the final look in her grandfather's eyes as he had faded into the light. But there was a lightness in her chest now, a freedom she had never known before. The key in her hand, now dim and lifeless, was still a reminder of the power she had claimed, the legacy she had embraced. And then, with the warmth of the first sun of morning on her face, she understood. This was only the beginning. The world was healing, but it would never be the same. And neither would she. Margot stepped forward, the path ahead uncertain but full of promise. She carried with her the strength of generations, the memory of a promise fulfilled, and the knowledge that even the darkest night could be overcome with the right light. The echoes of her grandfather's voice, now distant but clear, whispered one last time, not with fear, but with hope. "Wake up, Margot. It's time to begin."